I've gotten the hint that I should do shorter, more frequent content, therefore I'm going to review each episode of Ed and Eddy in under a minute. Okay, here we go. The Untouchables of the very first episode of the show, and it shows. The show didn't have that great a start, to the point I'm happy I only started regularly watching Cartoon Network when it was in its 4th season, or I would have ignored the show completely. The plot is that some kids' belongings have supposedly been stolen, so the Eds volunteer to find them in exchange for cash. They seemingly catch the culprits, only to find the belongings were just misplaced, and they get their comeuppance for their quick judgments, which will become a recurring theme. Being the first episode, the characters aren't as developed as they would become, with some voices still not finalized, and the humor is yet to find its timing, most of it's coming off as slow and random. Even the first season episode introduction music doesn't sound right. That said, the episode still does well with establishing its suburban setting and most of the main cast of the show, including their personalities, relationships, and some quirks, especially Double D's knack for making fantastical gadgets out of mundane junk, and of course the show's trademark hilariously oversized jawbreakers in under 11 minutes. As well as most episodes, beginning with a disconnected separate story that will have little to nothing to do with the main plot. So in that sense, this is a decent start and would pave the way for much higher quality material as the series continued. Also, it has a structure, which is more than I can say for most of its first season. Nagged Ed is only the second episode of the show, but it introduces 3 of the show's biggest problems, Lee, Marie, and May, the Canker sisters, or possibly half-sisters, given they've had multiple dads. They're the closest the show comes to antagonists, and boy did they antagonize. This episode shows the Eds first meeting them, and at first they're quite accommodating, giving them food and letting them watch TV, but they abruptly turn aggressive and demand they do housework, and for the rest of the runtime they alternate between acting like neglected spouses or the abusive partner in the relationship. Needless to say, the Eds, and by proxy the audience, are horribly confused by all this, and they finally flee. And sadly, this is one of the better appearances of the Cankers. Their role in the show was as a near-unstoppable destructive force of nature who targeted the Eds in particular, forcing them into uncomfortable romantic situations, usually non-consensual kissing, and just being aggressive bullies to the cul-de-sac in general. And most times it showed up, the episode would be worse off for it. The first season especially suffered, where many episodes would end with them appearing out of nowhere and ruining things for the Eds, like a crutch the writers used when they couldn't think of an ending. Like most elements, they would gradually be fleshed out, even gaining unique personalities, and be better utilized to benefit the series' humor, but they'd remain the most painful part of the show, particularly the early seasons. Pop Goes the Ed is usually mistaken as the first episode, including by Cartoon Network themselves. I understand the confusion because even by Season 1 standards, this episode feels primitive. There are technically 2 opening sequences, one where they're in bee removal service and one where they're trying to escape the heat, and even in terms of the show's detached openings, there's no transition between them and the main plot of the Eds crashing a backyard pool party. The episode's humor feels especially disconnected, with things happening just for the sake of happening. No build-up or payoff, just Eddy gets a pig head stuck in his mouth, which ends up in Jimmy's quiche, and then onto the next gag of them making awkward conversation. And any remaining comedic potential they could have had is ruined by the terrible timing and animation quality. Seriously, the fluidity is all over the place, and the sound cues are either underwhelming or non-existent. The only thing of consequence is that the Eds show up in very tight speedos in an attempt to stand out, and halfway through the party, they tear off, which apparently also happened to series creator Antonici when he was young. And instead of running home, since clearly nobody noticed, heck, their speedos are eaten without reaction, the Eds dive into the kiddie pool and spend the rest of the episode keeping others away from it, until they finally sneak away in the dark. Even with how many times I saw this episode when I was younger, I never realized until this revisit how badly this episode was written, paced, or animated. Also knowing how his character would develop, seeing Double D do half these gags just feels wrong. Over Your Ed is weird, yes, even by Season 1 or show in general standards. Ed is poor personal hygiene and is a klutz, so Eddy and Double D try to help him be cool, and the result is one of the dorkiest takes on being cool I've ever seen. Seriously, is this how the loser in another show would dress and act to make it unquestionably clear they have no idea what they're doing, and would be mocked mercilessly for, especially since Double D is writing his lines. But he's a hit with the others, so they put on a show where he just wandered around being cool, I guess? I guess the joke is that a style that would be ridiculed on any other show is seen as chic in this universe, but with the show's purposely ugly art direction, it's hard to tell what these characters consider attractive. And the Cankers show up to ridicule him for the rest of the runtime, so I guess I'm too distracted by more terribly paced slapstick to ponder anything. Yeah, I don't get this episode. If the intention was to show Ed with a personality makeover, it would have been wise to wait until he had a personality. I will give it credit that there are traces of what would become staples of the show's humor, including Double D's inventiveness and obsession with hygiene, as nonchalant destructiveness, and most notably, Eddy's frequent attempt to scam the cul-de-sac, which would become the focus of many episodes. And Double D high in sugar is probably the funniest gag of the show so far, even if again the animation is energized enough for it to reach its full potential. Overall, this is an odd but promising episode where they're starting to know which direction they want to take, they just don't know yet where they're going. Also, this episode might be the reason for Ed's later hygiene phobia. So Ed a lot is the funniest opening gag of the show so far, which is an extended sequence where Eddy's polishing a sports car to impress the other kid, until he admits he has no idea whose car it is and walks away. Not gonna lie, that's hilarious. Sadly, that's the only funny joke, as the plot involves the team babysitting Ed's spoiled younger sister Sarah, who is literally declared herself queen and expects to be treated as such. So the rest of the episode involves the Eds kowtowing to Sarah's every whim, then trying to prevent her and her friend Jimmy from trashing the house. Have you ever seen a babysitting episode in any show? Then you've seen this episode. Yeah, I don't like Sarah either. She's not as bad as the Cankers, but she's a colossal brat who never faces repercussions, and basing an episode around her means a miserable experience. This is also another episode hurt by how early it is produced. Ed seems too aware of his predicament compared to how he'd later be portrayed. If this was made for another season, he wouldn't be warning his friends away, he'd be obliviously laughing in his chair, and Sarah would be taking advantage of how stupid he is, possibly even turning him against the other Eds when they got out of line. The struggling act Eddy does is impressive, but all I can think about is that in later episodes, Ed would be doing this. And what's this perspective? Is Eddy opening the door to a dollhouse? Also, the episode just ends with no resolution, which is the other way most of Season 1 ended besides the Cankers. That said, the animation and rhythm are much improved over the previous segments, as seen with this admittedly impressive horse race, and there's much more of a sense of comedic timing and impact. I just wish there was more comedy to show off. A Pinch to Grow in Ed is an episode I remember not originally liking, but revisiting it, it's actually one of the better episodes of the season. Eddie's upset that he's the shortest kid in the cul-de-sac, so Ed and Double D help find a way to make him grow. I do like how in denial Eddie is about his height at the beginning, including insisting he and Ed are at the same height, and saying tall people aren't allowed in his room. And when the other Eds help him out, it results in some funny gags before he's given remote-controlled boots he can control the height of, which begin to earn him respect with the rest of the neighborhood, as well as provide some good physical comedy. I guess the main problem is pacing. Eddie doesn't wear the boots until the last 3 minutes, when I feel he should have gotten them before the halfway mark, and most of the focus would be on him wearing the boots to boss others around. And like a lot of Season 1 episodes, the scenes feel more like individual sequences than one big narrative. There's a scene with a few gags, then they fade to black, then there's another scene with a few gags. It feels disconnected and probably what originally turned me off. That and it's another Canker Sisters ending. But to their credit, I don't think the episode could have ended any other way than it does. If they didn't mess with the remote, one of the other kids probably would have, and we'd likely get the exact same turnout. So it's technically one of their best appearances. The comedy is approaching prime show levels, especially the end gag of them falling from space. It just needs to be faster and more violently impactful to reach that point. So yeah, this is actually one of the better Season 1 episodes and a good sign for the show as a whole. Dawn of the Eds is a fan-favorite episode, and it's easy to see why. The Eds find out about a space movie they want to see, but it's only for adults, so they theorize what it's about. As they do, they find themselves in the junkyard where they start play-acting their space fantasy, pretending they're astronauts stranded on a hostile world, and just having fun with the idea. And that's a good description of the episode. Fun. Not funny, but it's interesting just watching these kids' imaginations run wild. Especially Ed, whose grasp on reality was slipping into basically this throughout the show. The best part is where Ed's explaining the movie's setup, and they arrogantly travel through real-world equivalents as he does, like a swinging wrecking ball when he mentions an asteroid field. And the rest of the episode is literally just watching them play. Yeah, it does start to get boring, and you're waiting for a point that never comes. In fact, the episode itself seems to get tired since the characters eventually give up and go home. Yeah, it's another plot that just ends, but there's at least a reason. So while it's not one of my favorite episodes, I can see why it is for others. It's exciting to see the world through someone else's eyes, especially imagining little kids, and I like that they establish a few locations that would be recurring settings throughout the series. Also, this is one of the rare times the Cankers are scared off, so that's a big plus too. Where did go? God, that's hard to say. It's an episode where everything happens, yet nothing happens. The Eds see a banner for a club and decide to build their own clubhouse, and we get to see every step before that clubhouse. Picking location, finding the wood, constructing it, advertising it, bragging to the friends about it. Yeah, sorry, this one has always felt tedious to me. It's just sounding like the episode, yet each sequence feels like it goes on for an eternity, with very few jokes or physical comedy keeping things interesting. The best part is where Ed's afraid of heights and won't climb, so they attach him to a pulley to raise him to the platform, but he keeps falling back down and has to be raised up again, each time grabbing a decent portion of the lawn, even switching it up at one point. Actually, come to think of it, these sequences aren't that bad, it's just the unfunny dialogue slowing everything down. If these montages were silent, I think that would have been funnier. But what's not funny is that the Cankers take over their clubhouse, and the last 2 minutes of the Eds having a water balloon fight, getting hurt, and ending with them just giving up. I think with some rewriting, this episode might have been one of the best, just shorten the construction sequences and show the Eds hanging out in their club, which makes it more unfortunate when the Cankers move in. And maybe end with the clubhouse getting trashed. As is, I don't hate it, but I don't like it as much as I want to. Also, why is there a phone in the mailbox? Read all about Ed. Do I have to talk about this one? Because there's nothing to say. Double D has a paper route, so Eddie increases their order in an attempt to make more money. And then the rest of the episode is just them delivering newspapers. There are no standout jokes, no funny physical comedy. It's just them shoving multiple papers in mailboxes, which I've never had a paper route, but even I'm pretty sure that's not how it works. At one point, Double D is attacked by a dog, which I think is the only time one is ever shown, and he builds a newspaper delivering machine that, of course, breaks down thanks to Ed. And the rest of the runtime is just them cleaning up the papers and getting rained on. Ed's final comment, I guess, is kind of funny, but it would have been funnier if Eddie said it. The only thing I can point out is that the characters' personalities featured here are more emblematic of how they be for later seasons. Eddie's ambitious but lazy, making his friends do all the work. Double D is overly optimistic and ingenious, but a persnickety to a fault. And Ed is helpful but destructive, usually being the one to ignorantly ruin Eddie's scheme. Also, this is one of the first examples of Rolf's exaggerated old-world farm life that would be further exemplified in later episodes. Besides that, no, this episode is boring and one I always skip. I don't hate it, but only because I forget it exists. Also, does anyone even remember what a newspaper is? Quickshot Ed is one of the best episodes of the season, which is good because it's also the episode that introduced me to the show. The Eds find an instant developing camera in Eddie's attic, then decide to take pictures of the other kids to fill and sell a calendar with. I love what I like to call reaction episodes, where we get to see characters of different personalities react to the same stimulus, in this case being photographed. And we do get some funny reactions, including Kevin repeatedly being blinded and crashing, and Rolf literally turning himself into a sausage. When I first saw this, having no previous knowledge of the show, I thought these kids were aliens on a school project to photograph Earthlings, further strengthened by how Double D precedes each photo shoot by comparing the characters' actions to animal behavior. Though having now seen the show, I wasn't that far off, and even back then I thought there was a lot of good physical comedy, especially Kevin's Terminator chase through Johnny's house. Though them photographing gnats from outside her bedroom window has probably aged worse than even the Cankers. Speaking of which, this is another Cankers ending, but the Eds did antagonize them, so they deserve it this time. So even if the personalities are still a bit off and the way the animated dizziness looks awkward, this is definitely a fun episode to check out. And remember ancient time when we didn't have phones to take pictures with. And Ed Too Many is another episode where all I can do is roll my eyes. Double D finds a rare flower and offhandedly gives it to Sarah, who takes it as a symbol of love, and spends the rest of the runtime pestering her new boyfriend. I don't like Sarah her normal mood, and her acting more childishly flirty is equally as unbearable. I don't care if kids actually do this, it's still obnoxious and makes for a poor episode. Especially since that's all we're given. Sarah fawning over Double D and screaming at the others when they get in her way. There are no funny lines, and physical comedy is slow and forced. I guess Jimmy being jealous is kind of funny, especially when he abruptly turns rabbit and mauls his teddy bear, but it's not enough to carry an episode. Or even a minute-long review. And it's another episode episode that just ends. Jimmy asks Sarah to play with him and they run off, Sarah completely forgetting about her crush. And Eddy, who hasn't done anything wrong, gets screwed out of $20. Sarah crushing on Double D would be a recurring element, but most future references would thankfully remain subtle. I don't know what else to say, there's literally no reason to watch this one, though as someone who loves pizza, seeing the Eds making their own never fails to make me hungry. Oh geez, 2 dud episodes in a row. Ed and Seek is exactly what you think it is. The Eds play hide and seek with the rest of the kids, and that's it. They find the kids and they hide from them, and it's unbelievably even less fun than an actual game of hide and seek. Now what separates this episode from the last is that there are some slightly funny moments. Eddy's comment about Ed having buttered toast for a brain, Johnny using Plank as a divining rod to find Sarah, even the Canker's random cameo is a bit amusing. There's a joke that could have been funny where the Eds tell Plank his parents are calling and he actually peeks out of a bush, but nothing follows it. And yeah, the hiding spots do get creative, especially for the Eds who start out hiding in a fake bush before Ed blows it up. I love the cartoon gag where we hear screaming fading out and in as someone is launched up and falls back down to earth, so this moment is on my good side. Unfortunately, these moments don't support an 11-minute episode, and the runtime feels a lot longer than it is. I feel like some episodes were written backwards, where they had some jokes they wanted to somehow work into the show, so they wrote a bare bones plot to use them in, instead of writing a plot and thinking up jokes that work best for it. And that's how this feels. There's some jokes, everything else is fluff. There's not even an ending. The Eds run off and hit themselves with a tree. We don't even know if they win or not. I guess if you have to watch this episode, just watch the gags I mentioned and skip the rest. This episode can go hide, and I'm not going to look for it. Looking at My Eds is another fan favorite episode and one I like well enough. Double D gets a hypno wheel and the Eds use it to hypnotize the other kids, hijinks ensue. It's technically a reaction episode like Quickshot Ed, but this time each kid is given a random hypnotic command not based on their actual traits, except maybe Jimmy, who goes from a wimp to a bodybuilder, basically reversing his personality. I guess what the kids are hypnotized into acting like are funny, but again, all I can think about is how much funnier there would be with later seasons' improved timing and animation. Still, I do love the creative requests made by Ed when Rolf is hypnotized, including a giant man-eating noodle. The funniest part is when they try to hypnotize Johnny, but he seems immune. Plank, however, isn't. Though they ruin it by having Johnny hypnotized later. Oddly, the most enjoyable part of this episode for me is the bus ride at the beginning. Not only is this something I would have liked to do when I was a kid, but the timing and animation is probably the best we've seen so far, with some great cartoon expressions and physics. Double D's matter-of-fact statement following the disaster also cracks me up. The rest isn't as fun, especially since it's another canker ending, and one I can't justify. They wrote themselves into a corner, so cankers. Still, I understand the appeal of this episode, and it's pretty good, especially for season 1. Also, it just feels good to watch Sarah eating a bug. Tag Your Ed is somewhat favored by fans, though mostly for the last half. The first half features an overly long and overall meh opening with the Eds trying to eat cereal but having no milk and no desire to get it out of a cow. What follows is basically a pinch to grow an Ed, where like how Eddy was mocked for being short, Double D's mocked for being weak. So Ed and Eddy try to help him gain some muscle. It ends exactly like every other nerd who's trying to exercise routine in comedy media. So to win back Double D's confidence, Eddy advertises him as a wrestler, and what fans mostly remember about this episode. Double D as his wrestling alter ego, the Masked Mumbler. Which, yeah, give him credit, the costume is pretty memorable, though I hope you watch that plunger. After a one-sided fight with Plank, the Cankers show up and Eddy challenges them to a fight, and the rest of the runtime is the wrestling match, with the outcome exactly what you think it is. But even though we know the winner, it's still a fun and funny sequence, and one of the best Canker appearances, as they show off some great gag wrestling moves, including using Eddy as an accordion to polka. So while most of the episode is boring, this last bit is worth the wait, and has resulted in one of the most fan-beloved character variations of the show, as well as a fun Cartoon Network browser game back in the day. How can you make pranks boring? That was the challenge Fool on the Ed took on and passed with flying colors. One day, for some random reason, the kids decided to play pranks on each other. Yeah, they don't even go the obvious route and say it's April 1st. Eddy vows to prank the neighborhood, but is beaten to it by someone calling themselves the Prank Master, who has elaborate traps set for all the kids. The timing is horribly off, and it's mostly not funny, especially since we get a lot of effect without seeing the cause and vice versa. Also, it turns out there was no Prank Master. The kids just did it to themselves to prank the Eds. Yeah, I don't get it either. The Eds build a massive stink bomb and retort, but it gets stuck and goes off in their faces, but also the rest of the neighborhood, so victory? I don't know. Eddy setting up an elaborate trap for Double D at the beginning is creative and well-timed, and you do feel his disappointment with the jawbreaker he thought was a trap is taken by someone else, but other than that, this episode is a slog and I keep forgetting it even exists. The only prank here is from the writers making us think this episode was worth our time to watch. A Boy and His Ed is an episode. Kevin's dad gets a job at the Jawbreaker factory, so Kevin's garage is now packed with the candies. Upon learning this, the Eds try to become best friends with Kevin, so they'll have access to his stash, by which I mean they creepily obsess over him and destroy his stuff. Yeah, this isn't an episode I like, but it's not a completely bad episode. There are some good gags, like them using Ed in a clown wig to clean Kevin's chimney, or trying to tunnel into his garage only to find themselves in his bathtub. Which, why does Kevin bathe with his hat on? Actually, I was surprised to learn that this was a season 1 episode, since the characters' personalities and voices are almost, if not exactly, on point with how they be for the rest of the show. Down to Double D's intellectual monologues, Ed's nonsensical non sequiturs, Eddy's temper tantrums, and Kevin shouting his catchphrase of dork. But yeah, it's the off timing and pacing that gives it away. Besides the gags I mentioned, it's just not funny and nothing is accomplished. It's not good, it's not bad, it just exists. And you do feel bad, it's one of the few times Kevin tries to be nice to the Eds, but it's completely brushed off. Though it is also one of the very rare times Double D removes his hat and confirms that he does indeed have hair. It's Way Ed is an episode I relate to more than I'd like. The Eds find the other kids obsessed with the latest fad, but every time they try to join in, the craze is switched to something else. They then try to one-up the neighborhood by inventing their own fad, but it never catches on. Until it does, and they're caught unprepared. I've never been up on the latest social trends. I don't even know what the latest memes are. I'm still using jokes that stopped being relevant over 10 years ago. Heck, I think a lot of references I use in my videos are from before half my audience was born. Case in point, I'm reviewing a 25-year-old cartoon. So the Eds trying and failing to keep up with the rest of the kids is something I identify with. Not that I've ever worried about being cool, since I've never had a chance to be cool. As for the humor, it's fine. Seeing all the different crazes the kids go nuts over is fun, as well as the montage of the Eds trying to find the next fad before anyone else. And a lot of these props have become recurring jokes and elements throughout the series. It's just nothing made me laugh out loud. I'd be lying if I said this was one I watched a lot, but I don't mind when it's on. It's aged better than Basil Marceau. Oh, you don't know who that is? My point exactly. Laugh Ed Laugh has surprisingly become more relevant recently. The entire neighborhood has suddenly fallen ill, with only the Eds out and well. Left with no kids to scam, Eddy loses his mind, becoming more out of tune with reality than even Ed. Given the events of a few years ago and what's arguably still going on today, I feel the theme is one a lot of us can relate with. Just the empty, almost apocalyptic imagery of the cul-de-sac can conjure up memories of times someone would like to forget. Unfortunately, this episode is about as funny as that period as well. The Eds trying to keep themselves entertained is itself not entertaining, and Eddy going cray-cray is sadly not as funny as it sounds. He just runs around doing random stuff until the very end. This is another plot I think would have worked better in later season, not just for timing, but impact. A later episode is about Eddy being unable to think of a scam, and it's a shock because he's been doing it for over 4 seasons. Here, this is only his 5th or 6th time, so there's not as much significance. Also, really bad audio sync issues when he's diving into a pile of fake money. That said, Eddy becoming so desperate he plays the shell game with squirrels and actually bilks them of their nuts will never not be funny. A Glass of Warm Ed has a very disturbing title and opening card, both for different reasons. Besides that, it features Ed going on a sleepwalking rampage, emptying the neighborhood's refrigerators. And I hope you're entertained by that, since it's basically all that happens. Eddy and Double D follow Ed as he unconsciously eats all the food in the cul-de-sac, and Jimmy at one point. Also Double D's cactus. It's not the most boring of episodes, but it's light on humor. Though I'll give it credit that, again, the personalities are basically what they'll be for the rest of the show. We get some good lines from Ed when he briefly wakes up, and the sequence where he's flying through the air using underwear is creative, especially with the calming piano soundtrack featured as Ed obliviously devours the neighborhood. As is, it has just enough to keep your attention, but you'll probably forget you saw it afterwards. Except for the end gag, which, while disgusting, is also inventive, and one of the few times the Eds technically win. Flea Bitten Ed is another episode that's basically just one joke. The Eds start a pet boutique and wash Rolf's animals, only to discover that Ed's allergic to rabbits, so they have to put it on hold while they deal with Ed's allergic reactions. And that's most of the episode. The Eds are often compared to the Three Stooges comedy troupe, and it's most evident here, where several gags feel taken directly from their shorts, including the assembly line pet cleaning and Ed trying to scrub a quote-unquote dirt stain off of something. Though, being a cartoon that had to be less inventive than the original live action, they don't have the same punches they did there. Paradoxically, the highlight of this episode is its inventiveness, with Eddy and Double D coming up with different ways to help diagnose, then treat Ed's condition using regular household appliances and utensils, which makes the drawn-out joke still fun to sit through, and I do love the shot of Ed failing to hold in a sneeze. Unfortunately, the beginning and ending just aren't as funny, especially since it just ends. There's a background joke where the rabbits are multiplying, which haha, haven't seen that before, and they take over the neighborhood. The end. But I do appreciate another look into Rolf's cultural heritage and routine, which, alongside Ed's non-sequiturs, is the funniest recurring element of the show. Who, What, Where, Ed is an episode that could have been funnier than it is. The Eds run out of eggs, so they ask Rolf for one. Rolf agrees to trade for sawdust, leading them to ask Kevin for sawdust. Kevin then asks for something, and before long, the Eds are stuck with a list of demands from each of the other kids. My problem isn't that this is a plot I've seen from many a Saturday morning cartoon, or the mandatory trading quest from every RPG that nobody likes. My problem is that the list is just too random. It feels like each demand was taken from a random word generator. Just things for each character to say to lead the Eds to the next thing they need. If we knew why they needed each of these things, like we were clued in on or even saw the bizarre reason why they were in demand, I think the episode could have been one of the funniest of the show. As is, each request just feels like padding. They do change it up slightly where they fail to grab an item, so they have to ask for another request, but it requires a canker appearance, and you know how I feel about them. There's also a quick gag where they're going door to door asking for clams, which I think is one of the funniest gags of the show. And Ed gets in a couple good lines. But ultimately, even when I originally watched this as a kid, this episode bored me. Especially since we know that even if they get what they're after, something's gonna ruin it for the Eds, which does happen. And if Rolf wants Ed's yo-yo, why not trade that for the egg and be done with it? Keeping Up with the Eds is another episode I keep forgetting exists. The Eds ruin Double D's lawn, so Eddy sprays the entire neighborhood with his dad's special fertilizer to grow it back. It works too well, so they borrow Rolf's goat to cut the grass down to size. And if that doesn't sound funny to you, well then you're in trouble. After the last few episodes that felt like how the show would eventually play out, this just feels like a major backtrack in timing, pacing, animation, and even character voices. As Rolf and Double D sound like they did at the beginning of the show, not the current iterations. Ed still gets in a couple good lines, but the timing and animation are back to just looking awkward. Though I guess Rolf's goat Victor eating the grass and nothing flat is amusing. But why do they need Victor when Ed was overqualified at cutting the grass with a push mower? And it leads to another great gag involving Rolf's curious custom, so I guess it's fine. What's not fine is that the episode just ends. The Eds technically win again, but they're trapped under Victor, and I don't know, it just stops. Yeah, you're not missing anything by skipping this episode, but it does introduce the sticky notes Double D's parents communicate with him through, which becomes a recurring element, so there's that. Exaggerate is another title that's really hard to say. The Eds accidentally destroy Kevin's window, so they quickly make up a story about the monkey boys. Feral humans that supposedly live near the neighborhood and cause chaos. However, their deception works too well as the other kids immediately band together to flush out the monkey boys. And just for laughs, Eddy thinks up additional methods along the way to further their delusions. This is another episode that's fine. I didn't find any jokes that were that amusing, but the pacing and timing are decent, and unlike the last several episodes, it doesn't feel like a chore to sit through. I like the concept of the Eds building a backyard theme park, which is something they'd attempt again in the future. Eddy basically painting himself to a corner by continually feeding the kids supposed clues of the monkey boys' whereabouts is funny, if predictable. The best gag is Eddy smashing Ed's feet so they'll swell up and leave giant footprints, then probably getting stuck to Ed's foot. Ed has a couple good lines, and even Double D gets in a few snide remarks, a character aspects that we'd seen more of that hasn't really manifested until now. Besides that, this episode is The ending is also though surreal with how the Eds even ended up this way. And why Johnny wants to help them out, I have no idea. Oath to an Ed is one of my absolute favorite episodes, and tied for best episode of the season. The Eds learn about the Urban Rangers, a scouting movement headed by Rolf, and want to join so they can wear their quote-unquote cool uniforms. Yeah, like an over-your Ed, I don't know what's attractive to the kids of this universe. I love the Urban Rangers. Rolf is already one of my, if not my absolute favorite characters, and when you combine the odd customs of his homeland with the seriousness of his scouting program, you get one of the most entertaining recurring gags in the entire show. They're funny whenever they show up, and their introduction is no exception. Just the weird scenarios the Eds have to go through to earn a badge are entertaining enough, but what's even funnier is how they manage to spectacularly fail at each one. Even when it's just changing a toilet paper roll. The timing is spot on, there are multiple great gags, and the dialogue, especially from Ed and Rolf, is hilarious. My only issue, besides the underwhelming opening, is Rolf's attitude. You'd think he'd sound more and more annoyed with the Eds every time they fail a seemingly simple task, but he keeps the same tone until the very end. Maybe the voice actor hadn't quite figured out his approach yet. Also, the end task with Sarah feels like intentional sabotage. Regardless, this is a hilarious episode that I love to return to time and time again. Also, I'll gladly eat that flavor of burrito. Fun Your Ed is an episode where the only reaction I can muster is, huh? Eddy gets a fly stuck in his voice box, rendering him completely mute. They attach a bell to him, which is supposed to help him communicate, and Rolf becomes his interpreter, comedically misinterpreting everything Eddy wants. Okay, ignoring the fact that a pen and paper would fix all these problems, heck, it's even brought up and completely misunderstood, this is one of, if not the, stupidest plots of the show. Most other bad plots are just mundane. This, I have no idea what they were thinking. Rolf just says what he thinks Eddy wants, and the others go along with it, no matter how much it hurts Eddy. Yeah, you just feel sorry for him. He did nothing to deserve any of this, and yet he's nearly drowned, nearly freezes to death, and is overall beaten and humiliated. This also makes Double D look really bad. He's supposed to be the smart one, yet all he comes up with is a bell, and he's fine with just watching Eddy suffer. Ed's dumb and Rolf has strange customs. What's his excuse? The timing and energy are fine, there are some good Ed lines, and this chicken fight would have been great in another episode, but nothing justifies having to watch Eddy getting beaten mercilessly for no reason. I never liked this episode, but I never realized just how stupid and unpleasant it was until now. This is one of the worst episodes of the show, and a definite skip, even if Rolf's feast looks appetizing. I've asked the Eds' final episode of season 1, and in my opinion, tied for best. The Eds started a cruise line, and it's a surprisingly fun and legit cruise. I want to go on this boat trip. I love boat trips. I hate swimming, but I love being on the water. Besides that, there are just too many good elements to list in a minute review. There's Double D's musical talent, there's Ed literally motorboating, there's all the ways they utilize common household items, there's the fight, and there's the many good jokes and repeatable one-liners for most of the characters. The only issue is that it's a canker episode, but even then they're actually worked into the story and serve as a real antagonist. They're not just dropped in because the writer didn't know how to end things. And the ship battle is legitimately exciting, with the cankers acting as pirates to the Ed's cruise ship. Also, Eddy is technically the making of his own destruction, as he just couldn't leave something stuck in the inner tube alone. But yeah, the cankers do still win, which is really sad, as I feel like this is something the Eds could have done as legitimate business. Heck, this is something I would have wanted to do when I was their age. Regardless, this is just a great episode with some great lines and great slapstick, easily one of the standouts of the whole series, and a good sign of things to come as the show transitions into season 2. Know What All Ed is the episode that kicks off the second season. The Eds find a box of turkey basters and market them to the other kids as Canadian squirt guns. As they play act like it's the Wild West, it seems like the Eds are finally having a good day, until the cankers come to town. After its rough first season, it's good to see that the show got to continue, and that they ironed out most of the rough edges for its next season. The kids' personalities are more defined, the plots are more structured, the physical humor has much better timing, and the jokes are funnier, especially Ed's frequent non sequiturs. The budget is also clearly higher, resulting in much more fluid movement, brighter colors, background detail, and animation perspectives. Add that there's a more lively title card theme, and overall it's a massive improvement. However, being one of the first episodes of the season, there are still a few leftover awkward elements to transition out of. I highly doubt Double D would normally be comfortable roughhousing in the junkyard or hugging a dirt pile, and it's another episode with the cankers showing up out of nowhere and winning in the end. That said, there are still some great gags and one-liners, including possibly Ed's most well-known quote of the entire series, and it's good to see Eddy with the talent and not just relying on his friends to do everything. So while it's not one of my favorite episodes, it's a very funny, well-made episode, and a great way to kick off the rest of the series. Also, why hasn't anyone marketed a turkey baster as a squirt gun? Dear Ed is a strange episode that I strangely like. Johnny and Plank have a falling out, so Eddy tries to hook him up with another friend, by which I mean he draws eyes on other inanimate objects and lets Johnny's imagination guide him to something they can pawn off on him for cash. While I don't hate him, Johnny's a hit-or-miss character for me. Sometimes he's funny, but quite often he's obnoxious, annoying, and I want off the screen. This, however, might be Johnny's best episode. He has an overactive imagination that may even exceed Ed's, to the point he refuses to acknowledge Plank isn't actually real. So it's funny seeing him instantly create personalities for each of the objects he's presented with, but also fascinating as his interactions basically serve as a coping mechanism while he deals with his issues. Every interaction he imagines is toxic, as he realizes how much he misses Plank and that ultimately nothing can replace him. It's an interesting look in this kid's psyche, and oddly enough, one of the less weirder things we'll see from him as the series progresses. Besides Johnny's interactions with his new friends, there are a couple other funny moments. The opening where Eddy's using Ed as the bulldozer is creative. Eddy and Double D trying to get Ed to read some cue cards is funny and goes about as well as you think. And while the party at the end just seems random, there's a really good background gag I only recently noticed where Johnny and Plank scoot closer together every time something obscures the camera, so we're left wondering how Plank is even moving. So while I don't love the episode, I think I actually like it better now than I did watching it as a kid. Knock Knock Who's Ed is the episode Spencer Breslin is watching as Izzy the Kid. Bet you didn't know that. The Eds are excited for an upcoming monster movie marathon, but Eddy peeves off Sarah and they're locked out of Ed's house, requiring them to find another TV. And yes, WD brings up that they could just go to one of their houses and watch, but Eddy says it'll ruin the plot. This is an episode I tend to forget exists, not because it's bad or even that boring, but I don't feel like much happens in it. There are some creative gags like the opening with the green jello trying to get back into Ed's house by disguising themselves as a giant doll only to find themselves perched on a street lamp, and faking a plane crash trying to get Kevin's house. But they feel disconnected and like they go on forever with no payoff. But it's when they get to Rolf's house where things really feel like they drag and I just start tuning out. I love Rolf, but even a boring story for him is still a boring story. Actually, the funniest thing in this episode is that Rolf actually owns a TV, even if it's this exaggeratedly ancient, possibly radioactive Old World 2 box. It's real later that Rolf still holds the old superstition that film steals the soul of the subject, so what does he think is happening whenever he turns on the screen? Does he also still think there are tiny people living in his TV? But despite that and some funny gags, this episode is mostly mediocre. Of course, for this show, mediocre still means entertaining, and you'll find some things to laugh at. Still, I didn't need to see Ed peel and shoot candy off his leg and offering it to Eddy. 1 + 1 = Ed is not only one of the best episodes of the show, it's one of the best of any show. The Eds go on a quest to take things apart and learn how they work, and end up literally disassembling the workings of their world. Yes, this is an episode where the fourth wall isn't just broken, it's completely demolished. The Eds just start reverse engineering whatever they come across, and suddenly they break reality. And I mean suddenly. One minute they're disassembling a washer, and the next they're eating the sun like a cookie. While the show had a wacky tone like what we associate with Looney Tunes, it still had rules that mostly grounded the characters in reality, save for the occasional gag that required a more cartoonish take. But here, every single rule of their existence is completely shattered. They could be destroying the laws of perspective, they could be removing characters' outline, they could be trapped inside another character's eye. They could even be cutting a hole in reality itself, and the longer the episode runs, the further into madness things progress until finally it just snaps back to normal, or as normal as the show gets. And like we don't know how it started, we never find out how it ends, but this is the case where the less we know, the funnier it is. Just the raw creativity on display makes it clear why this episode is near or even at the top of many people's lists of the best episodes. Every joke works, every gag is funny, and the visuals show that everyone from the writers to the storyboarders to the animators had a blast making this episode. I can't do it justice by description alone, it's something you have to experience yourself. And yes, this is where that Many Dorms meme originated from. Eeny, meeny, miny, Ed is as much fun to watch as it is to say. Eddy convinces Ed that Double D is a mutant who made the rest of the kids out of insects, wreaking havoc with Ed's tenuous grasp on reality. All seems hilarious until Eddy is mistaken for a bug himself. What makes a lot of the episode funny is its unpredictability. A lot of gags you genuinely can't see coming. Like when Double D's pocket rings and he pulls out an hourglass instead of a clock, or when Eddy tells Ed to defend himself with the mirror and he uses it in his own way. I also like gags where you see someone in a position, then it cuts away, then cuts back and they're in a different position. But the funniest thing is just watching Ed's paranoia grow and grow until he finally gives in and surrenders to the supposed mutant insect colony. And of course, Double D has no idea what he's talking about. It's also fun to see Eddy having a blast watching Ed lose it, only to take the gag too far and end up the target of everyone's random violence. Yeah, Eddy's cockroach disguise is so convincing, all the kids just spontaneously abandon this big barbecue Naz invited everyone to just to squash the Eddy bug. Ed has some fantastic lines and facial expressions, and I'm impressed with how they show darkness without actually darkening the screen, so everything's still visible. This episode is just a lot of fun. Is it one of my favorites? Not really. There's a lot of good humor, but nothing that made me burst out laughing, and the episode just ends abruptly. But it's still a good time watching Eddy manipulating Ed's fragile state of mind, only to have it backfire in its face. Right said Ed is two of my absolute favorite gags in the whole show. The first one is where Ed's wind-up monster toy literally chews through Eddy's stomach, and the other we'll get to later. Kevin sets a new bike record, impressing the neighborhood and making Eddy jealous, who's pledged to also break a record and humiliate Kevin. Kevin is an interesting portrayal of the popular kid in a cartoon. Usually these are antagonists who use their wealth and or muscle to attract and intimidate others into liking them, but Kevin actually does show talent, endlessly wowing the others with his abilities. He has reasons for the rest of the neighborhood to think it's cool. He has nothing to prove, he already knows he's awesome and that everyone knows it too, so in a sense he's one of the show's more likable characters, and this episode is a good portrayal of Kevin's more positive traits, and also one of his negative. After failing once, the ends up claiming built a rocket car and invite the neighborhood along for the ride. What follows is another one of my absolute favorite moments across the show, where Eddy simulates zooming across the world with a homemade rocket sitting on top of a popcorn machine, and Ed and Double D running in front of a moving screen while wearing different outfits. I am so blown away by the ingenuity of this scam that I think I've seen this moment more than any other scene in the show. But then Kevin brings it to an abrupt halt, which why? This is one of the best creations the Eds have ever come up with, so what if it's fake? It's like one of those backyard theme park rides somebody put a lot of time and attention to. I'll gladly pay a quarter to ride it. And another if they tell me how Ed and Double D change costumes without anyone noticing. Hands across that is an episode that could have been so much funnier. The Ed's recruit talent for a fake telethon, and it goes poorly. Yeah, sadly not much happens in this episode. After a mildly amusing opening with the Eds trying and failing to attract quarters with a giant magnet, Ed starts dancing around and Eddie decides to put on a show, where he recruits a total of 2 performers, both of whom fail miserably in front of the crowd. If this was a neighborhood-wide talent show where you got to see everyone do something you're good or you're even terrible at, and if the show actually seemed like a success until something happens at the very end, I think this could have been one of the best episodes. But instead, it's just a 2-minute show where Naz sort of wows the crowd with their awful tuba playing, then Jimmy completely botches his magic act, and everyone gives up. Then it's right back to the magnet. There are some good gags like Ed looking for a donation despite having no idea what one even is, and Rolf unintentionally destroying Jimmy's axe by being the tallest kid in the cul-de-sac, but otherwise there's really not much to say, other than the predictable ending that the axe they turned down is what the kids literally throw money at. Yeah, this is another episode I keep forgetting even exists, and one I have literally nothing else to say about, except it's funny how we see an old camera screen when they're using a box as a camera. Foster Ed is another episode with a very weak premise. Ed is losing the last of his baby teeth, and Eddie, wanting tooth fairy money, offers to pay the neighborhood if they can get it out. All of them fail to do so. Honestly, I don't know what hope this episode had in the first place. A good number of cartoons from around this time had plots with the character losing tooth, and I don't think any of them were anyone's favorite episode. Maybe it would have been interesting if we saw some really far-out methods they used to try to get the tooth out, similar to what they do in the later one of those Ed's episodes, but we're pretty let down on that front as well. Rolf takes a plunger to Ed, Sarah tugs on his tooth or a jump rope, and Kevin goes fishing, and none of them are as funny as they sound. The best is where Eddie fools Ed into thinking of fence board as a jawbreaker, and the fence is destroyed, save for the area Ed crashes into. That's kind of funny, but not funny enough to sustain an episode. Then Eddie loses a tooth. They're trying to get the tooth fairy to come early by putting a bed on the roof, which they fall off of, and they end up losing both teeth due to stupidity. The end. I guess the opening gag is pretty well done, where they open a water park that gets a positive reaction, meaning another thing they could repeat for legitimate cash they never come back to, and it's funny how Ed's lip-syncing to a speech Ed recorded playing on a boombox hidden under his hat, but nothing's funny or interesting enough to warrant repeat viewings. It's not bad, it's just bland, though it is one of the earliest examples of Ed's fascination with buttered toast. In Like Ed is an episode that could have been funny if it wasn't so mind-numbingly stupid. Kevin is outselling the Eds at competing yard sales, which leads to the Eds somehow deducing that Kevin is part of some vast underground circle of knowledge. And while this sounds like an idea Ed would pull from comic, it's Double D who comes to this conclusion. Yeah, this is another episode where Double D is the stupidest one in the group, which usually end up the worst of the show. And to further prove that point, the Eds also deduce that Jimmy's birthday is a secret meeting hosted by Kevin, so they dress as spies as crash the party. Now, I'm not opposed to a spy episode, and a lot of the gadgets Double D comes up with are pretty interesting, some reminding me of Kids Next Door, but the Eds come to their conclusions completely out of nowhere. They just assume that there's something weird going on and make things up on the spot. Like Double D deciding the punch is laced with truth serum. It might have been funny if Ed and Eddie were the delusional ones and Double D was trying to stop them, but the fact that nobody, including Double D, catches on that this is Jimmy's birthday party is just facepalming. On top of that, the humor is some of the most predictable in the entire series. Is Double D disguised as Naz going to lead to Eddie confusing Naz with Double D and doing something embarrassing? It is? I must have seen a comedy at some point in my life. And let's not forget they straight up ruined Jimmy's birthday. While the yard sale at the beginning is kind of funny, this is one of my least favorite episodes in the entire series. It's just one big cringe for me watching the Eds do stupid things and ruin the day for everyone, which I know is basically the show's premise, but here they look especially bad for it. Who let the Ed in? Geez, what is this, the 4th dud episode in a row? Ed has an imaginary friend. That's it. That's the entire premise. Ed suddenly decides he has an imaginary friend named Jib after reading a comic and he hangs out with him instead of the other Eds. First of all, Ed seems too strange to have an imaginary friend. I can see an episode where Jimmy or Sarah annoys everyone with one, but Ed doesn't seem the type to think of a normal imaginary person. Secondly, Jib is boring. Ed just seems like some nice guy, except for times where he's a prankster. If Jib were some kind of repressed psyche of Ed's, like he's very intelligent, coming up with genius plans that shock both Eddie and Double D and making them feel threatened and losing relevance, that might have worked. And third, the episode is boring. I don't think there's one funny joke or gag in the entire episode. It's just Ed doing random things with Jib, making Eddie and Double D feel left out. Heck, the episode gets so bored with itself that there's a 30-second sequence of Eddie spontaneously attacking a tree. The only interesting part is where they go to Johnny to ask him what to do about an imaginary friend, and Johnny, who's best friends with a plank of wood, has no idea what they're talking about. Oh, he didn't need him since Jib is actually real. I guess Eddie grabs him and is thrown around and pummeled, but still somehow wins as he calls a bus and throws Jib on board to get rid of him. I don't know. I really don't know. Unlike the last episode, there's nothing that makes me cringe, but it is one of the least funniest, most boring episodes of the show, which still makes it one of the worst for me, especially since I wanted to see how Eddie's prize grabber machine worked. Home Cooked is an episode I shouldn't like, yet I kind of do. The Kankers are on holiday, so they park their trailer in front of Eddie's house and treat the neighborhood like a vacation resort, much to everyone else's annoyance. I've already made it clear that I loathe the Kankers. Most of their time, their only joke is that they're overpowered bullies put in just to make everyone miserable. But this episode at least gives them something interesting to do. They treat the cul-de-sac like they're on an international sightseeing trip, demanding entertainment from the locals and pillaging their homes for souvenirs. And it's so absurd that I have to admit I was entertained, wanting to see what they would do next. Okay, they're still torturing the Eds, but there's more than unwanted romantic advances. Even the Eds get caught up in the moment at times. On top of that, there are some great running gags. Ed critiquing certain moments of destruction and bragging about how they do them better, as well as sadly moaning that others got to say or do stupid things he wanted to do, is really funny. One of the souvenirs the Kankers acquired is plank, so we get to see Johnny stalking them throughout the episode, and even Ed trying to force in rhymes with declining results is worth a laugh. But if the Kankers on vacation wasn't already funny, what ends their holiday is downright hilarious. Also including a great payoff to Johnny and Plank's art, and it's an episode where the Kankers technically lose, so what's not to love? Well, I'm glad the last episode was funny because we're back to more crap with Rambling Ed. Ed has finally had it with Sarah's constant bullying, so Rolf allows him to move into his shed. What follows is every single unwanted guest home invasion story from every single sitcom ever. Ed takes advantage of Rolf's hospitality and makes his life a living hell. Oh wait, it's not just Ed. Eddy and Double D also contribute to Rolf's misery, which yeah, this is another episode where Double D is out of character. You just feel so sorry for Rolf, who at every turn is bombarded by the Eds getting in his way and making his already strenuous farm chores more difficult. All Rolf did was give Ed a free place to stay, but I guess no good deed goes unpunished. It gets so bad that the Eds end up eating all his food, leaving him to the mountain of dishes to wash, and even stealing his bed. Which, speaking of things Double D would never do, if it was just Ed doing all this stuff as it should be, that would at least be more understandable, but I guess they couldn't just focus on one of the Eds, so they had to work all of them in, no matter how little sense it made. The Eds eventually get what's coming to them, but it wasn't worth watching Rolf tortured for no reason. This doesn't even feel like Ed and Eddy, it feels like a bad episode of SpongeBob. I don't know why they attempted this plot. Nobody likes these episodes, and the lukewarm opening doesn't save this from being another of the worst episodes of the show, though Ed and Eddy playing with each other's lips is pretty funny. You know, maybe season 1 wasn't as bad as I thought, because To Sir with Ed is yet another stinker episode, and the worst so far if you can believe it. Eddy's parents go out for the night and hire Naz to babysit him, and if that doesn't already make you go, huh? The Eds misinterpret this as Naz taking Eddy out on a date. I hate babysitting episodes, I hate awkward date episodes, and I hate misunderstanding episodes, and look at that, we have all three in one! That doesn't help that the humor is some of the most disturbing in the show. I didn't need to see Ed dragging his butt on the carpet like a dog, or sucking on Eddy's leg, or undressing and bathing Eddy, or Eddy falling naked through the ceiling and flashing everyone. Even the Urban Rangers, one of the best recurring gags in the show, say and do absolutely nothing funny. But then there's the biggest issue. How old is Naz supposed to be? I always assume most of the neighborhood kids were around the same age. But if Naz was hired to babysit Eddy, that just brings up disturbing questions of the age gap between them. Maybe the joke is that Eddy's parents don't trust him to be alone, so they hire a same-age babysitter, but things are too ambiguous to be funny. Also, Naz is a terrible babysitter, throwing a party in the house where she's babysitting. I guess I admire them for trying to give Naz characters, but what they do ruins how I see Naz as a character. This is an episode that just leaves me cringing and digging into my seat. I have never liked it, and it's just gotten worse as I've gotten older, to the point it's bottom 3 bad for me easily. Even Ed playing with the razor can't save this episode. With Key to My Ed, we're finally back to some actually good episodes. The Eds find a key lying on the ground and try to find out what it unlocks. Failing that, they hold it for ransom and hope someone pays up for it. This should be a boring premise like the one with Ed's tooth, but there's a surprising amount of variety. The opening sequence with Ed drinking a soda is hilarious, one of the funniest in the whole show, and Eddy randomly kicking Double D in the next week deserves laughs too. Then there's them trying the key on everything but a lock, somehow also ruining Jimmy's braces, and there's how the kids receive their vague ransom notes and the kids getting to the meeting place, all expecting everything but the key and immediately blaming each other for stealing their possessions. Oh, and then the Canker show up, but everything is funny up until that point. This episode was on one of those GBA video cards, so it's one that I've seen most out of the show, but even with how many times I've seen it, its rapid-fire physical comedy and some great gags from Ed never cease to make me laugh. The only issue, like I said, is that it ends with the Cankers, and this may be the worst Cankers ending, since they do something that was wrong back then and really hasn't aged well now. But as long as you remember to turn off at this point, this is one of the show's funniest episodes and one I'd love to revisit. Oh, and Johnny is a running gag for some reason. For a long time, Urban Ed was my absolute favorite episode. The Eds are bored with their quiet suburban life, so they build a city that the rest of the neighborhood is eager to explore, including Plank, which is bad news for Johnny. I freaking love the city the Eds build in this. I love the scope, I love the detail, and I love how much they accomplish with just cardboard boxes and standees. It's something I would have built when I was a kid if I could. So yeah, all my life I've always wanted to visit Edtropolis, especially with how much fun the Eds are having playing different roles throughout the city and how the others humor them. Role-playing and interactive facsimiles of real-world environments has always fascinated me. I had an unhealthy obsession with the grocery store simulator at the Children's Museum I regularly visited as a kid, which led to my unhealthy obsession with farming and management games. But besides the environments, the episode as a whole is just really funny. The sequence with the Eds making Johnny play a random game to trick him into giving him cash is another of the best opening gags of the show. Double D protecting oblivious Naz from pigeon splatter also gets a laugh. And like I said, there's just all the roles the Eds take on and everyone's reactions to city life. My only problem is that it's an ending where the Eds don't deserve to lose. Johnny goes berserk, steals Eddy's money that he rightfully earned, and Ed absentmindedly destroys the city, which crap, that could have been a great recurring setting. But besides that, it's a fantastic episode and easily in my top 5. Though why did Kevin want a corn tattoo? Stop Looking Ed is the plot I usually hate, but kind of works here. Eddy is fed up with being told what to do, so he tells the entire neighborhood to rebel, which everyone gleefully does. We've seen this plot in everything, where kids don't want to follow rules, so they break them only to find there were rules for a reason. And for the most part, that's what this episode does too. I guess why I like it here is that they emphasize comedy over learning a lesson. It's funny to see the different ways the kids break the rules and how easy it was to get them to turn. Even Workaholic Ralph is just fine with abandoning his chores, despite how he'll get capital punishment if they're not done. And when Double D won't turn, Ed and Eddy try to break him by literally breaking everything in his room. This is an example of torture done humorously, where his reactions are funny from how cartoonishly he overacts. It's relatable, but you also realize that he does need to calm down. Besides that, the opening sequence with their Jawbreaker detection satellite has some good gags, and we get some of Ed's most memorable moments, including that woodpecker meme. But the best part is the ending, where Double D, sick of all the rule breaking, announces he's called everyone's parents and they're coming home to sort everyone out, causing the kids to panic. Because even if they can't understand long-term consequence, the last thing any kid wants is an angry parent, which is also a good lesson to teach. So while it's not a favorite of mine, this is still a good episode, and presumably the first where the Ed see Double D without his sock hat, which will serve as blackmail later. Honor Thy Ed is an episode I don't like and once really hated. The Eds are dared to go into a supposedly haunted house where they pretend to be attacked by monsters, only to realize they're locked in and the house might actually be haunted. Until recently, I remember this episode to be a lot worse. I thought all that happened was the Eds went into the house, they tricked the kids, and the kids realized they were tricked and wouldn't help the Eds out of the house, and then they just wandered around for a while until the end. But watching it again, the Ed does have more going than I gave it credit for. The old house interiors are really well drawn and appropriately spooky, especially for young kids that have been locked in, and they incorporate a lot of haunted house tropes, like trick bookshelves, trapped dumb raiders, and creepy mirrors, which lend the writers some creative animation. But it really gets interesting when each of the Eds are tempted by the greatest desires that lead them right into a trap. That unfortunately leads them into another canker ending, and one of the most painful, where they're forced to marry the sisters. Now, in the episode's defense, that's the point, that out of everything the haunted house has shown them, this is their greatest fear. But I'm sorry, nobody deserves the cankers. Especially when they're forced to pull them through the neighborhood as the other kids point and laugh at Stephen King's Carrie. So while it's not as bad as I remember, and the opening sequence of them drinking hot sauce is pretty funny, it's still bad and not one I want to revisit. Want some screams for your haunted attraction? Play this episode there on a loop. Scrambled Eggs is an episode that teeters between being hilarious and tedious. Double D was up all night building a toothpick model, and he just wants some sleep. Unfortunately for him, everyone wants his attention. And unfortunately for them, he's not all there, making any advice he gives dubious. So the episode is basically one joke. Everyone wants Double D to help them, and he's either asleep or doesn't know what year it is. It's a gag that can easily get old, but what saves it is in how many ways everything goes wrong. He designs a water park for Ed and Eddy, and it collapses. He tells Rolf to use wax to repel lobsters, and they attack him. And when Johnny needs help, he just completely cracks and ignores him. So there's enough to make it interesting. The other funny thing is how a near unconscious Double D is just dragged around like a ragdoll, even banging into rocks, getting buried, and almost uses a body for Jimmy and Sarah to operate on. But for me, the best part is the build-up and payoff. Double D gets so many things wrong and inadvertently gets involved with so many problems that everyone eventually wants a piece of him, which is interrupted with, thanks to Double D's halfway calculations, Eddy's SeaWorld sign ends up blocking the stream, resulting in Rolf's garden flooding and infesting his farm with lobsters, and eventually flooding the entire cul-de-sac. This is one of the rare episodes that build up to a gag, and it's pretty satisfying here. I also like how Rolf sees his animals as such close friends he's willing to eat Johnny before any of them. But yeah, everything just ends with Double D still not getting any sleep. The episode's not great, but I admit it could have been a lot worse, and even half asleep Double D knows better than the sleep in Ed's bed. Red Ed is a grammatically incorrect title, and another takes one joke and runs with it. The Eds decide to start a repair service where they fix anything and everything, which proves impossible with Ed's penchant for destruction. This is another episode that could have been really repetitive, but does enough to avoid that label. I love the animation of watching Ed fall and the unexpected finale to their opening circus stunt. I love how Eddy guilt trips Jimmy into letting them help, but he's just standing by his door waiting for Jimmy to inevitably change his mind. And when they break Johnny's seat trying to get him stuck for a tree, it's fun seeing them use Ed as a multi-tool to patch it back up. Showing that, even without Ed being destructive, it's clear Eddy has no idea what he's doing. But the best part comes when they have to destroy Johnny's house and Eddy just gives up and turns it into a sauna, going so far as to build a sign over Johnny's face using plank. And despite their best efforts, Ed finishes the job. This is a pretty fan-beloved episode from what I understand, especially where Double D screams about the support beam. And while I don't think it's that good, there are elements I like. The escalations of Ed's destruction is well built, starting with him ruining a seesaw and ending with him demolishing an entire house. And there's even a callback to the opening sequence, so it comes full circle. So it's not a favorite episode of mine, it's one I watch every now and then, and it's one of the few times Eddy keeps his money at the end, so good for him. Shoe Ed is an episode I don't hate, but I don't like either. When Eddy realizes just how annoying Johnny is, he makes him even more repulsive, then sicks him on the other kids so they'll pay him to remove Johnny. All seems fine until he finds the one kid who finds Johnny charming. I already said that Johnny's not one of my favorite characters and one of the most annoying parts of the show, and this is a whole episode based around seeing how insufferable Johnny can be, so that should give you a clue how much I like this one. I guess the various ways Johnny can be annoying is slightly interesting. I do like how they keep him in a crate marked danger as they move him around, but when the episode's not annoying, it's surprisingly boring. I've seen this episode multiple times and I don't even remember half of it, especially the beginning where Johnny's torturing Kevin. You'd think I remember that, but I never do, and then he encounters Rolf, who's delighted by Johnny's annoyance and invites him to some kind of game where pigs lick his feet. Yeah, the less I know, the better. The only two gags I actually enjoyed are where Ed gets Johnny out of the birdhouse by pulling a tree underground, or when Double D provokes Johnny with a broom. And I guess the Frankenstein homage is funny. Besides that, I just don't have patience for this episode. I can't call it one of the worst, and it's not even Johnny's worst appearance, but it's definitely not my taste. And this coming from a guy who legitimately wants a bite of Rolf's sandwich. Ed and a Half Shell is an interesting episode if nothing else. Sarah tells the Eds to babysit Jimmy, which Eddy initially hates. But when he realizes Jimmy wants someone to bond with, he teaches them everything he knows, making him literate in the language of the con, possibly too literate. So to me, this episode isn't that funny. There are maybe two gags I was amused by, and the rest are just meh, especially where Ed pees himself. But what makes this episode work is the bond between Eddy and Jimmy. I like how they adopt a big and little brother dynamic, and that Eddy really wants to teach Jimmy, if just because it'll make him a more tolerable person to be around. But since Eddy had a toxic relationship with his older brother, it's why he also passes on to Jimmy, since that's the only way he knows how to teach. There's a lot you could look into with that. I also like the montage where Jimmy does start to think like Eddy, including getting Ed to do all the heavy lifting and treating his friends like dirt, all of which culminates in a great payoff where Jimmy turns out to be a better con artist than Eddy, and briefly reverting back to his meek persona to get Sarah to abuse Eddy as payback for everything he did to him. We see this darker side of Jimmy pop up in later episodes, and I have to respect him for showing that while he prefers the meek and mild lifestyle, he's not someone you want to cross. So while there aren't many jokes, this is a fascinating look into the chemistry and mindsets of several of the kids, and maybe a hint as to why Double D wears that hat. Mirror Mirror on the Ed is another fan-beloved episode. The Eds play truth or dare, and they dare each other to act like each other. That's pretty much all that happens, but also all that needs to happen. Many of the best moments in TV are where a character has to act like another character, and even more impressive where the voice have to voice another voice in the first voice. So it's a lot of fun hearing Eddy pretend to be Double D, or Double D pretending to be Ed. But Ed being Eddy is the best, which considering he's played by veteran voice actor Matt Hill is not surprising. There's no much else to point out. Basically, the whole episode is just watching the Eds pretend to be each other. There's a quick plot where Rolf needs Eds to squish berries and has no time for their role-playing, but that doesn't really lead anywhere. But really, just watching the Eds pretend to be other Eds is entertaining enough. My favorite part part is where Ed breaks character and hugs a chicken, only to go back into character and say the chicken stole his quarter. I guess my only issue is the ending, because it just ends. Kevin wants to pound Eddy, Double D's mistaken for Ed, and then it's playing. The end. I think it would have been funnier if they took their acting too far to the point they offended who they're playing, and then they either tried to switch back or switch to another role, and there's a big fight, and everybody's left wearing a bit of everyone else's clothing, and they don't even know who they are anymore. Regardless, this is a fun episode of just to watch and hear the Eds do their impressions of the other Eds. The opening where Ed is too stupid to know he's supposed to fall is also a good laugh. Hot Buttered Ed might be the first episode I ever saw in its entirety. It's beach day, and the Eds find they overslept and Kevin's stolen their spot, so they move closer and closer to snag it back at their first opportunity. This is another episode that's more a collection of gags than a coherent plot. The idea is that the Eds are trying to snitch everyone else's spots so they're more enraged to get to Kevin when he moves, but it's mostly sidelined in favor of watching Ed act like a lizard or Eddy riding Ed like a camel. And as gags go, they're okay. I like how Ed skips Eddy across the water like a stone, or the Eds playing shadow puppets in their tent, and Ed's battling Brookline is freaking hilarious. There's also a subplot where Double D forgot to pack his sunscreen, which he laments all throughout, and the Eds end up burned to a crisp. I don't have much else to say other than it's adequately funny. I think I saw this shortly after Quickshot Ed, and it made me realize the show wasn't about aliens. But as someone who was brought up almost entirely on Disney at that point, it was still too alien for my mind, and I wouldn't find a taste for the show until years later when I could regularly watch it on cable. And nowadays, when I am a fan and have seen the whole show, I see this episode as okay, just okay, but I am shocked Double D isn't wearing a shirt to the beach. High-Heeled Ed is an episode that gained some controversy. The boys of the neighborhood are out, leaving Sarah, Naz, and Jimmy, so Eddy has to come up with a scam for a more feminine audience. But as all men discover, it requires more research than he was counting on before he just accidentally stumbles across something women want. While I don't know if anyone hates this episode, I have seen comments that it hasn't aged well. It's a general, arguably sexist depiction of the girl trope that was in most media of the time. To the point the Ed's ultimate plan is to play game of jewelry, and while you could see it that way, I don't know. I think the episode and the show in general does show the girls with more rounded personalities than most other depictions. They're not just sitting around painting each other's nails, they are playing outside and engaging in more unisex activities, even playing tennis at one point. I think it makes more fun of the Eds being completely clueless, since as Eddy admits, his scams are more geared to the boys of the cul-de-sac. So just as a straight adult man watching, all I can do is shrug and say, yeah, whatever. Besides that, this episode is okay. We got some good gags as the Eds try to hide and learn from the girls, and Sarah wearing a slinky as neck jewelry is pretty funny, and Eddy starring a swamp tour in the sewers is another thing I would have wanted to do as a kid. The ending is pretty anticlimactic. The Eds are back at square one, except Ed isn't wearing pants. It's overall an average episode, though if they were going for a more female-centric story, shouldn't the cankers have ended this one? Ed, besides being hard to say, may have the best opening sequence of the entire show. I absolutely love every second of Ed and Eddy wreaking havoc in Double D's parents' room. The writing, the animation, the physical comedy, Ed's quotable lines. This is one of the finest 2 minutes in all of comedy. It makes me laugh every time I watch it. And the rest is pretty good too. Ed convinces himself that it's Christmas and tries to get everyone in the spirit, even though it's July. You just gotta love Ed here, being his overly optimistic self and trying to celebrate while everyone else is in the middle of their own holiday. Yeah, Jimmy invents Piggy Bank Dank, where everyone dresses up and acts like pigs as they smash their banks. And making up holidays is another thing I tried to do as a kid to middling success. The jokes are fine, but I don't understand why everyone turns on Double D about to smash a piggy bank when that's exactly what they were going to do, and the yo-yo Ed gives to Rolf makes another appearance, here being regifted to Johnny. Besides the opening, the funniest part is the Eds caroling door to door gathering donations. My issue is again with the ending, since Eddy gets needlessly screwed over. He buys a big bag of jawbreakers, or is then stolen by Ed, who hands them out to the neighborhood. Just come on, Eddy earned it legitimately for once. Let him have this. Besides that, this is a fun episode that I will gladly watch the opening of over and over again, and if I'm bored, maybe the rest as well. Cry Ed is the final episode of season 2 and not a bad one to go out on. Jimmy is hurt and Eddy becomes jealous of all the attention he's getting, so he fakes his own injuries only to find he actually has to hurt himself to gain attention. After Ed in a half shell, I'm left wondering what if Jimmy is genuine and what's Ed act he likes to put on to get in his way. Even with how frail he's depicted, I have a hard time believing even the clothespin would injure him, so in my head he's manipulating the neighborhood to drive attention away from Eddy and onto him. Wouldn't it be hilarious if they faked the first one, but every injury afterwards is genuine and Jimmy starts regretting the slippery slope? That's just my headcanon. Regardless, this is a pretty okay episode. Eddy's escalating attempts at getting attention are pretty funny, trying to outdo Jimmy at every turn. Jimmy is injured, so Eddy pretends to be injured. Jimmy actually gets hurt, so Eddy also gets hurt. Jimmy's put in an injury-proof suit, so Eddy makes his own injury-proof suit. Just the desperation Eddy shows to give a sliver of attention is hilarious, but even though the focus is on Eddy and Jimmy, Ed is still the best part. Him explaining that Eddy's fake injuries were the result of a giant Swedish meatball is in the top 10 best Ed moments, and when Eddy actually wants to get hurt, Ed's happy to oblige, dropping a house on him, which I was seeing is not the first time he's done so. Rolf also gets in a good line as Eddy falls on him, so it's not a great episode, but it's still fun to end the season on. Here's hoping for more laughs as the show continues. Season 3 starts with another of my favorite episodes, Wish You Were Ed. When Rolf reveals he's homesick, the Eds trick him into thinking he's returning to his country of origin. Rolf is one of my favorite characters, so it's nice to finally see an episode centered around him, at least one where he's not tortured mercilessly. And it's a very creative and funny episode, where you get one of the most in-depth looks into his heritage. To me, this feels like the rural version of Urban Ed, where instead of a city, the Eds build their interpretation of an old-world village. And apparently they're more spot on than the crude background suggests, as Rolf asks absolutely no questions, which he probably should, considering he has friends and family that still live in his home country, and maybe he should wonder where they are and where he's planning to stay now that he's supposedly stuck. Yeah, this episode is funny enough to ignore those details. I just love seeing Rolf do stuff for reasons known only to his culture, and the Eds breathlessly trying to keep up the charade. The opening sequence with everyone driving a different vehicle is pretty interesting and could have been its own episode, and Rolf passing out after smelling Ed's shoe is very impressive for a Cell-Drunk cartoon. And of course there's Rolf's and Ed's dancing that's become a meme. My only major problem is the pacing. The old world stuff doesn't happen until over halfway through its runtime, so the gags and ending feel rushed. I wish this and Urban Ed were double-length episodes, but that wouldn't happen until later. Regardless, this is a great episode and a great way to start the season, even if I had to shrink Peach Creek for this overhead shot. Mama's Little Ed is an episode I really love and really hate. When Double D's day is packed to the brim with chores his parents left on sticky notes, Ed and Eddy trick him into performing ludicrous tasks by perfectly forging his parents' handwriting. I've said that I don't usually like torture episodes where the only purpose is to make the life of someone who doesn't deserve a living hell, but the slapstick and Double D's reactions are so good in this, I can almost overlook that fact. I love that Ed is just a human photocopier out of nowhere, proving again he's not just your regular stupid. The tasks they forge for Double D to do are hilariously ridiculous, as are the consequences for them. Even the canker scene is funny, especially Ed trapping them all in a measuring cup. So yeah, I really enjoyed the first half, but things take a turn when Double D, thinking his parents have lost their mind, decides to move into Eddy's house. This is where it goes from funny stupid to stupid stupid. Genius level Double D legitimately thinks he can run away from home without consequences and live with Eddy, and Eddy doesn't get a say. From there he proceeds to take over his room and ultimately his life, including throwing out Eddy's possessions and forcing him to massage his feet. Holy crap, Eddy deserves to be punished, yes, but not by Double D turning into an oblivious jerk. All they have to do to fix this is show Double D caught onto their forgeries and this is his revenge, but as shown it's just Double D being a grade A douche. So yeah, watch the first half and turn it off after the cankers, because the rest is as painful as Rolf's hat of discipline. Once Upon an Ed is another of the show's best episodes. The Eds abruptly appear in Johnny's wall and they take turns telling him of the circumstances leading up to it. In the same vein as 1 + 1 = Ed, this is one of the show's most creative episodes where they abandon established settings and rules in favor of each of the Ed's fantasies. It's so much fun seeing the world through each of the Ed's eyes. Eddy's exaggerated and self-centered, seeing himself as much smarter and more successful than he is. Double D's down to earth yet blind and optimistic, seeing an ideal world the other Eds actually care about his long-winded lectures, and Ed is pure fantasy, straight out of the B-grade movies and comics he's obsessed with, which is why his segment is rightfully the longest. And the fantasy elements are sorely needed, because otherwise it would be a mediocre story where the Eds open a jawbreaker bank before the cankers arrive and torture their neighborhood. Probably the funniest part is at the end of Double D's story where Eddy interrupts and mocks him, and we see him morph into character of himself. But honestly, the whole episode is one big funny moment that has to be experienced from beginning to end to properly do it justice. It's easily one of my favorite episodes, and it either is or will likely become one of yours too. Though if the story suggests that the scam took place in the middle of the day and Johnny's going to bed soon after the cankers arrive, what's this kid's sleep schedule? For Your Ed Only is an episode I strangely like. Eddy finds Sarah's diary and tries to read it while Sarah launches a neighborhood-wide manhunt to recover it. By that description, this should be one of the most boring episodes of the show. It's just Eddy trying to sneak a peek at a couple pages of Sarah's diary while she tries to find it. And truth be told, I do keep forgetting this episode's sequence of events and what happens when. But what saves it are the incredibly funny gags and high-energy humor. The opening alone features Ed floating away in a bubblegum bubble, which Eddy then tries to sell to Johnny as a balloon ride, only for all three to float away and for Kevin to literally burst their bubble, causing Ed and Eddy to fall into and destroy Sarah's room and Johnny to get knocked to China. That is such a surreal and exciting sequence of events. It's one of the best openings of the show, and the rest of the humor is great too. Eddy using a hair to open the book, Sarah's little Eddy animation, Ed wrapping Double D in tape, Double D being the one to come up with the underhanded plan, only to immediately regret it, and especially them tying up Kevin while using international catchphrases, leaving him bemoaning that the show doesn't have subtitles. This is also the one episode where you feel sorry for Sarah. Sure, she's a sadistic brat, but her room was destroyed and her personal thoughts were stolen. I think a beating is justified in this case. So while the plot is weak, the humor is some of the best and keeps you coming back, and Ed saying he's a Borg shows he's a Star Trek fan. Who knew? It Came From Nowhere Ed is definitely one of the stranger episodes. Ed's comic inspires him to set up his own scam, which Eddy and Double D reluctantly help him with, even if they don't know where it's going, if anywhere. So this episode doesn't have many individual laughs. There's the opening where Eddy tricks Ed into thinking a monster is after Jimmy, and Ed squishes both of them, but after that I can't think of one gag that stands on its own. Instead, the episode's humor comes from its build-up and continual absurdity. Ed tries to put together his variation of his scam, and most of his actions seem completely random, including having Eddy in skull makeup offer the kids pancakes and telling Double D to put a rock on the letter Q. Just all the weird stuff Ed either does or gets his friends to do, does leaving feeling amused, and he even proves himself a better manager than Eddy, considering he gives the others a lunch break, even if it then cuts it short and tells them to get back to work, so maybe that practice being Eddy rubbed off on him. So yeah, the episode is relying on the audience's patience with Ed and what this is all leading up to, and when we finally find out, well, again, it's one of the stranger endings. It turns out Ed was reenacting a ceremony from one of his comics, and it didn't work, except then it does, I think. I don't think we're supposed to know what was supposed to happen, just that something happened, and if you felt this was worth your time, then great. If not, then I'm sorry. So while this episode loses most of its appeal once you know what happens, it's still an okay episode if just watch all the randomness built to something. Also, Sarah shouting Jimmy reminds me of an old British PSA. Three Squares and an Ed is an episode I see a lot differently as an adult. After Double D invites Eddy to slide down and shoot, they find that Ed has been grounded, so they work together to bust him out. Yeah, even when I was younger, I wonder what their end goal was. They wanted to get him out of the house, but he's grounded, so even if they succeed, they're just going to get in more trouble. If Sarah was demanding Ed be the prisoner in the game of cops and robbers, and the others are trying to save him from being treated like one, I'd understand that, but as is, I don't know what they're thinking. But speaking of Ed, I feel unbelievably sorry for him. Yeah, watching this as a kid, all you notice is the funny slapstick and escape attempts, but rewatching it through older eyes, it's appalling just how toxic Ed's home life clearly is, and how favored Sarah is over Ed. His parents took literally everything away from him, including his stares, which even Double D reacts to. And they're fine with Sarah treating him like dirt, letting her put bars on his window and going ballistic when she sees him with a book. Yeah, this episode takes things from conveniently exaggerated sibling dynamics to straight up child abuse, the kind the authorities should probably look into. There are some really good visual gags, including them sleeking along a handrail to escape Sarah, but knowing what I know now does make this episode hard to watch. You know, they had a plot idea where Sarah would turn Ed's room into her playroom and banish him to a cardboard box in the garage? Yeah, dropping that was definitely for the best. Dueling Eds is a mostly boring episode saved by the ending. When Eddy inadvertently insults Rolf's family tradition, Eddy is pressured into apologizing by the others, and that's most of the episode. Double D asking Eddy to say he's sorry, Eddy insisting he did nothing wrong, and Rolf following in his dishonor. Yeah, for the most part it's pretty light on jokes, and I don't remember a single Ed line. Even the opening where Eddy opens a martial arts school is pretty drab. Though Ed almost splitting Johnny in half deserves a chuckle, I guess it's also amusing that the Eds are pretending to drive around in a junkyard van, like they are emulating a sitcom where an event went badly and this is the awkward drive home. That's kinda clever, but otherwise this is an episode I can easily forget even exists, until the ending where Rolf demands a duel to regain his honor. This is where the episode gets ambitious, experimenting with different speeds, light and color tones, and background effects, and as Double D points out, clearly showing off this season's higher budget. I especially like this lens perspective as Kevin films the fight, even if I hate it when someone's filmed getting humiliated for the whole world to see. It's also the end of a running gag where Double D suggested Eddy bake Rolf cupcakes, which he steadily refuses to do, only to learn that cupcakes are the traditional sign of apology in Rolf's custom. So while this sequence is short, it does save the episode from being completely forgettable. Also, Ed Fish is the stuff of nightmares. Dimlet Ed is an episode I just don't see the point of. Double D is worried the other kids are getting stupider over the summer, so he organizes a scavenger hunt to revitalize their thinking caps. Even if you haven't seen this episode, you've probably figured out the ending before I even finish that sentence. Nobody's gonna learn anything, and Double D gets humiliated. I have never understood any episode of a show that features someone trying to make an effort to change. Before serialized programming became the norm, most shows, especially cartoons, worked on an episodic basis, and since practically every season was written and filmed at the same time, it was very difficult to introduce episode-by-episode continuity. So when somebody would change or attempt to change someone else, we always knew it wouldn't last past the specific episode, and the second they hinted that's what it was about, I knew the punchline and the joke is ruined, as is the case here. That said, it's another reaction episode, so we get to see everyone's unique response to the hunt. Johnny just collects random items, Rolf believes beats are the answer to everything, Kevin and Naz don't want the prize, and Ed and Eddy just try to extort it from Double D. So there is comedy, but overall I just don't care for this episode. It's one of the worst of the season, though saying that is a testament to the season's overall quality. You want a scavenger hunt? Go find a less overused plot to work with. Will Work for Ed is another episode that just baffles me. Eddy hires Ed out to work for Rolf so they can afford jawbreakers, but Rolf is a very old-fashioned boss, giving Ed deplorable working conditions and deducting his pay for equipment rentals and infractions, leading to a strike and Double D having to work as a mediator. This feels like one of those soapbox episodes where they're less concerned with telling a story of jokes and just want to preach their opinion on something. What their commentary is, I have no idea. Is it supposed to be a hint as to the working conditions of the studio or the industry as a whole or workers' rights in general? What are we supposed to learn from this? That Rolf is a bad boss and he should do better? No doubt, Sherlock, and if that was your point, shouldn't we have seen how Double D won him over so we know a real-world problem you were trying to address? Because as is, it just shows Rolf as a bad boss, but after a brief talk with Double D, changes its tone as everyone's happy, so well done whatever you did. And they obviously want us to take this episode seriously, since they didn't write much of it to be funny. I guess Ed being so wrapped up in the working man routine that he tries to start the car is fine, as well as Ed's response to Rolf that he went before he got there, but the bathroom humor shouldn't be the funniest part of anything. I want to like this episode, but I don't know what I'm supposed to like. I guess there's nothing bad about it, but there's nothing enough good either. And why is Kevin buying jawbreakers when he has a garage full of them? Ed, in a way, I think is the only episode to use Ed twice in the title. The Ed see a red balloon floating around and they give chase fixing the poppet, and that's the plot. Yeah, this is another one that's more focused on jokes than story. But as jokes go, these are some of the funniest of the entire show. There's the beginning where they sail Kevin a bike that he actually likes, only for it to fall apart and trash him in the process. There's where Ed throws Double D at the balloon, then absentmindedly throws a confused Naz right after him. There's them running in a tower, there's a cow falling on Rolf, there's Plank getting a better in-flight meal than Johnny, there's even Ed turning Eddy into a helicopter. There's a lot of good humor, which is why I wish there was a better plot to tie it all together. Whenever I remember these routines, I always forget what episode they're from, and want to remind myself I forget again because there's so little substance that sticks with me. Yeah, I'm once again struggling to fill out a minute review. This gives him so little to work with. Heck, it ends exactly how you think it ends. The balloon pops, so Kevin inflates another one for them to chase his revenge for the opening scam. The end. That said, this episode has some of the fastest paced humor in the show, with most of the runtime being one long chase sequence. In a way, it feels like the prototype for the acclaimed Don't Rain on My Head episode and the eventual full-length movie. There's very little bad about it. I just wish I could remember it exists, and that I could have a bite of Plank's gourmet airplane food. X marks the Ed is surprisingly not the treasure hunt episode. Eddy gets his it. Yeah, that's the premise. Eddy gets his first pimple and is embarrassed by it. This should be one of the worst episodes of the show, and it definitely starts out as such. After a very boring opening of them fishing, Ed points out Eddy's it and shows he has his own, something I definitely never needed to see. From there, we have Eddy trying to hide his ever-growing pimple from everyone, with Ed and Double D trying to remedy the situation the best that they can, and that's all I can do not to have a look of revulsion permanently plastered on my face. But the zit cream really hits the fan when Johnny breaks into Eddy's house and charges the other kids to view Eddy like an old-time sideshow freak, which, holy crap, is one of the worst things anyone has ever done on the show. And if you turn off the episode by this point, I don't blame you. But it's also here where it surprisingly gets good. After Double D admirably stands up for Eddy and throws everyone out, Rolf volunteers to help Eddy with his swelling, and we get an entertaining parody of a cooking show, where once again we're left in suspense wondering whether this is all eating, and when Eddy finally gets the remedy, we're left with one of the funniest endings in the entire show. Seriously, my siblings and I doubled over laughing when we first saw what happened and everyone's reaction. So this episode's kind of a reverse Mama's Little Ed, where it's a really bad episode that suddenly turns really good, and while despite some funny Ed lines, the first half is painful to sit through, it somehow feels worth it by the end. And his weird to admit Rolf's stew looks delicious. From here to Ed is a premise I'm surprised we didn't get sooner. Kevin inadvertently ruins Eddy's latest venture, so Eddy swears revenge on him, despite Kevin having no idea what's going on. I really like comedies of someone constantly trying to capture or hurt someone, but backfiring so horrendously the victim is completely oblivious to their efforts. Like a Coyote Roadrunner cartoons of Robin Hood Daffy, and that's what a lot of this episode feels like. Eddy targets Kevin with another method of hurting him, it blows up in his face, and Kevin just goes about his business none the wiser. Heck, besides a quick conversation with Double D, he has no idea the Eds are even in the area, so you'd think I'd really like this episode, but I don't. Okay, I don't hate it, but you even dislike it that much, but I don't think it's as good as it could have been. It may just be me unfairly comparing this episode to the aforementioned cartoons, but the comedy feels too slow. Each attempt to make Kevin miserable feels like it takes too long. I think it would have been funnier if we just saw them ready to attack Kevin without any of the setup or dialogue, which may be why the final attempt is the best, because they're suddenly on a fake cloud ready to fire a cannon at him, which, wow, where did any of that come from? I also like an earlier gag where Eddy leads the Eds through an underground route, only to return back to their starting spot to quote-unquote throw Kevin off before disguising themselves as Johnny to sneak past him. And Ed wearing a turtle's helmet gets a couple laughs, so the gags aren't bad, I just wish we had more of them, as the pacing was faster, but Eddy trying to admit defeat to Kevin, who still has no idea what's going on, is a satisfying ending. Boys Will Be Met is one of the most worthless episodes of the show. All the boys are attracted to Naz during a baseball game. That's the plot. One day, all the boys, except Jimmy of course, decide to fawn over Naz. Normally, episodes like this involve the character or affection doing something different with their look that gets everyone to notice them more, like changing their hair or wearing a new scent, but here everyone just randomly head over heels with Naz, including the boys who previously showed no romantic interest in her, so nearly every joke is centered around them trying to impress her. One of the boys does something, then another of the boys tries to outdo them, then another gets in their way and does his thing. Lather, rinse, repeat. It's the exact same joke a bazillion times in a row. I'd say it gets old and fast, but it's not funny to start with. The only thing breaking up the routine is Sarah occasionally getting so frustrated with the distracted boys that she tries to keep the game going, only to have one of the boys get in her way, and yeah, I feel as frustrated as she is. Between this and Just Sir with Ed, it shows us how clueless the writers were when it came to using Naz. Even in an episode dedicated to her, she has nothing to work with, and she continued to get the shaft in development until the movie. Double D manages to get a couple good lines, maybe one or two from Ed, but otherwise this episode is garbage. It only escapes being one of the worst because I keep forgetting it exists. It's so slow and one note, I'm surprised it wasn't a season 1 episode. And how do the Eds not know where Naz lives? Ed or Tails is okay, just okay. Ed orders special edition Jawbreakers from comic to share with his friends, but there's only 2. To their credit, they try cutting up the Jawbreakers, but it's not long enough to be funny. Double D tries to crack one, but they lose it to Johnny. So the logical action is that they either try to break the other Jawbreaker into thirds with a comedic montage where nothing seems to cut, or they just give it to Ed, since you know it's his candy. Instead, Rolf organizes a race with the Jawbreakers the prize, and that's the rest of the episode. And while the gags are funny and creative, especially Double D pulling various gadgets out of thin air and Ed trying to get Eddie's attention, there's just something wrong about pitting the Eds against each other. They work best when they work as a team, so this wacky racist-style competition doesn't have as much punch as it should. And honestly, that's how the whole episode feels. There are a lot of good gags, possibly more than a regular episode, but they feel flat when they're focused around the Eds fighting amongst themselves, a problem we'll see again in future episodes. I also fear the gags are too quick and numerous, which I would have loved to see in From Here to Ed, but here they're too fast to get a reaction, which might be why Ed in the clown car and him trying to divide 2 into 3 stand out, because they take their time. And I feel bad that nobody gets the Jawbreakers, including Ed, though maybe it's payback for him stealing Eddie's candy in an earlier episode. So the episode doesn't appeal to me, but I'm sure somebody out there finds it funny. Also, Plank stuck in Johnny's cheek earns all the sympathy cringe. Gimme Never Ed is one of the season's most ambitious. Plank is revealed to be a thrill ride enthusiast, so the Eds build multiple rides to bilk Johnny for everything he's worth. Just the ingenuity on display makes this episode worth watching. The detail put into building each of these complex rides out of everyday junk is on the same level as Urban Ed or Wish You Were Ed. I love seeing how each one works, and how close to death Plank or the Eds come to. One of the rides uses live termites. That's how dedicated and adrenaline junkie Plank is depicted. And while there aren't many jokes, I like Eddy taunting Plank on the bumper cars, and Double D commenting they have lumber to bilk is one of the funniest things ever said on the show. My major problem is that there are quite a few slow moments. The opening where Eddy teaches a surfing school is pretty boring, except for Ed dressed as Soda Machine. After the second ride, the episode basically grinds to a halt for 2 minutes, where we still get some gags, but nothing relevant to the plot. But it's all worth it for the ending, where Plank tricks the Eds on a dangerous roller coaster ride before sending them careening to the bottom. Again, seeing the scope and creativity of the ride and how many physical gags are crammed into this last minute is a spectacle to behold. So while I can't say this is one of my favorite episodes, it's still a lot of fun and one I occasionally rewatch, and it creates more ambiguity as to how sapient Plank may actually be. My Fair Ed is another episode of no point. The neighborhood kids are tired of how out of control Ed and Eddy are and demand Double D teach them some manners. After a painful lesson, they seem to have changed, but they may have changed for the worse. This plot is the exact same problem as Dim-Lit Ed. As I said in that one, we already know all changes will not carry over to any future episode. Why try to trick us into thinking Ed or Eddy will become different people? It's a knowledge that holds this episode back from being funny or engaging. Heck, I think this episode is actually worse than Dim-Lit Ed. At least there we got to see reactions from the entire cast. Here it just feels like the same joke repeated over and over. First we have a long sequence of the Eds messing up the neighborhood, then we have a long sequence of Double D conditioning Ed and Eddy to be more polite, and then we have Ed and Eddy torturing the neighborhood again, but doing it in the name of chivalry. Before outright admitting they were just kidding and Double D didn't cheat him the thing, leading to Kevin wanting to pummel him. Yeah, Double D really gets the short end of the stick in this one. That said, I like a couple of the gags, like the Ed squishing Jimmy with his unicorn art, or this equation that appears over Eddy's head, or especially Rolf screaming about his ruined eggplants. I've also heard Ed and Eddy's food chant being used in fan projects, but overall this episode just feels like a waste of time and another of season's worst. So it puts me in the mood for some bean paste. I certainly never realized the brilliance of Rockabye Ed until now. Ed has a horrible nightmare about Johnny and becomes terrified of him in real life, so the other Eds kids have to help kick his phobia. First up, the nightmare sequence is one of the greatest moments in the show. Unbelievably creative, with visuals that turn regular characters and elements into horrifying parodies that will have you laughing and screaming at the same time. But it's only recently I realized how much of a tease this opening was. It looks like they're finally going to show us one of the kids' parents, which is intentionally avoided up to this point, but she turns around and it's Johnny's head attached to what's assumedly Ed's mother's body. This is a joke only really appreciated after seeing the bulk of the show. Seeing this as a new viewer, I completely missed the joke, but if I saw it today, I know I'd be laughing my head off. Still, this opening is one of the greatest, and the rest is pretty good too. Seeing Ed's various reactions every time he sees Johnny and what he does to try to get away is a lot of fun. As is this scene where he jumps into a dryer to put on his clothes, and Kevin, who's acting as a judge, is at his gymnastics competition, altering a scorecard to read dork. Oddly, I wish these scenes were part of a different episode, because the opening is so good it overshadows everything else, so what would be really funny elsewhere just doesn't measure up to how it starts. Until the very ending, where once you see it, it will likely leave you shouting, "What?" while laughing your head off. So this is a great episode, but one I recommend you watch after seeing a good chunk of the show. Ed 11 is the treasure hunt episode. While exploring Eddy's brother's room, the Eds find a map that supposedly leads to the brothers' hidden stash of stuff, and after some decoding, find that it's hidden in the worst place it could be. What I especially remember of this episode is the first appearance of Eddy's brother's room, which will be further explored in later episodes, and is one of the most intriguing locations of the show. Every single thing in here I want to know the story behind. Why does he have a camel? Why is there a car in his room? Why does he keep his bed in the fridge? And most importantly, why was his room boarded up and wallpapered over? I feel like an entire season could be dedicated to this room alone, and then we have a map, an enigma in itself. It was kept in a trophy stem, so obviously it wasn't meant to be found, but when it is, the only way to decipher it is to put it up against Eddy's head, which his brother somehow knew the exact shape of and markings on despite having moved out years ago, and knew the exact map needed to pinpoint the location. I don't know, cartoon logic. And it turns out it's buried, of all places, under the Canker's trailer. Now the Cankers aren't great in this, but how they avoid them is, where they pretend to be construction workers fixing a sewer pipe. We get a lot of good headlines, and it's slipping everywhere after being coated in butter, and once they find the treasure, it just brings a lot more questions that fans debate to this day. So while not perfect, this episode is wildly entertaining and very creative, and shows that Double D watched The Big Lebowski, the most surprising reveal about his character. Luck of the Ed is another episode I saw before I started regularly watching the show. Eddy gives Ed his dirty magazines to hide from his mom, only for Ed to promptly forget where he hid him. And as the search goes on, Eddy's paranoia grows as he suspects that even his friends can't be trusted. I saw this episode back when I still thought the Eds were aliens, and I think that's affected how I see it even today. My mind is stuck in a clash between how I initially viewed it and how I see it now after watching the whole show, so I can't decide if I like it or not. There's not much in this episode anyway. Eddy loses his magazines, they look for them, they don't find them, and they look again. The end. The most memorable scene is watching Ed retracing his steps and trying to remember where he stashed the magazines, which is very entertaining and feels like something a voice actor improvised. The opening where Double D is trying to teach Ed physics only get a bowling ball in the gut is also entertaining, as are a couple visuals, like Eddy staring Double D down or Ed's face smashed between giant microscope slides. And the part where Eddy's threatening to drop Double D's hat and Ed's eyebrow down a drain is one of the more tension-filled moments of the show. Besides that, I surprisingly don't have much to say about the episode overall. It's just okay. Not good, not bad, but entertaining enough, and there are worse episodes to be introduced to the show through, though if you want to see my sister die laughing, reenact Ed's routine to her. Ed Passed It On should have been the sister episode to Ed 11. Eddy laments about no longer having his more popular brother around, so decides to trick the neighborhood and thinking he's coming home to gain some respect. This is another episode that clues us in on what kind of person Eddy's brother was and the impact he had on the neighborhood before his disappearance. And the general consensus is that he was a monster, with Kevin acting very nervous at the news and Ralph straight up walling his house in to protect himself. Though Naz seems charmed, possibly falling back on the girls love jocks trope, Johnny disappears so we don't get his outlook, and Sarah and Jimmy don't have an opinion, maybe being too young to remember him when he was around. It's just interesting seeing the light this character was seen in while knowing next to nothing about him. Speaking of, we finally get another trait for Naz, which she's revealed to be into mountain climbing. And that's most of this episode, seeing everyone react with fear and excitement to the news that Eddy's brother's on his way, because there's not much else going on. Ed poking Double D with a pin is funny, and to this day I spell respect the same way Eddy does here. I think the most entertaining part is the opening, where Eddy opens the restaurant, because that's another thing I really wanted to do even into adulthood, though I don't know why they made Ed the chef, or why they're surprised by the turnout. And the ending's another tease, where I think we're actually going to meet Eddy's brother, but no, we'll need to wait until the movie for that, and then it just ends. Brother Candy Spare and Ed is satisfying in the strangest way. Sarah gives Ed her allowance to buy fudge with, but Eddy convinces him to spend it on Jawbreakers instead. Facing Sarah's wrath for his actions, Double D promises to pay her back, and the rest of the episode is them doing just that. So I do have to ask what they thought was going to happen. How do they expect Sarah not to notice that they spend her money on candy for themselves? I'm sure there are stupider decisions, but I can't think of any right now. So when Sarah, of course, finds out, the Eds say they'll get their money back. And predictably, Eddy's method involves torturing his friends in a surprisingly violent way, even for Eddy. But what goes around comes around. While the plot isn't that funny, there are some really good visual gags in this episode. There's Ed's hula dance, which has also become a meme, that Jimmy and Sarah hunting through Ed's jacket for the fudge, which reminds me of a similar joke from The Simpsons, and there's Double D Mickey Mouse Eddy's actions with a steel guitar. But the best is where Ed starts visualizing Eddy and Double D as his shoulder angels, and they find inside his otherwise empty head. And I guess it's another episode where he feels sorry for Sarah since her money was stolen. So when Ed and Double D are fed up with Eddy's selfish attitude, you feel everyone's satisfaction watching him get pummeled for cash. There's a sadistic pleasure to this episode that does make it worth a watch, though what's the going rate for Jawbreakers according to this episode? The Day the Ed Stood Still is another huge favorite among fans. Ed wants to be a monster, and Eddy thinks it's a great way to advertise his theme park allows Ed to wear a monster costume, and lives long enough to regret it. First of all, the theme park is again something I really wish I could have done as a kid. Secondly, this is surprisingly one of the darker episodes of the show. Ed doesn't just pretend to be a monster, he's convinced he's some alien creature, so when the kids in the neighborhood start disappearing, you legitimately have no idea what he's doing to them. Okay, they're obviously fine, this episode wouldn't be allowed to air if not, but it's a tension that drives the plot along. We actually get to see Ed slowly becoming a monster through his eyes, as his vision fades into red and his breathing turns shallow, before it goes out to wreak destruction on the the others. And he's apparently smarter as a beast as he lays out traps to lure in the other kids that he then snares with a tentacle. But the best part is that we don't even see the full monster costume until over halfway through, again creating suspense, and when we do, it's a really impressive design. I love how it looks and how Ed moves in it, but Ed is still Ed and is easily distracted by chickens. I love how well this episode pays homage to monster movies and to Ed's dedication to said movies. And if Sarah didn't pull the mask off, I think things would have taken a very dark turn. I do see why this episode is so beloved, and while it's not top 10, it's a really good watch just to see how much of a monster Ed can be, besides the kind that steals his friend's jawbreakers, but I digress. If It Smells Like an Ed is the first double-length episode of the show. After Eddy humiliates Jimmy, the Eds are blamed for theft and vandalism, so the Eds must figure out who set them up. Yeah, gee, I wonder who it is. This is a very hated episode by fans, to the point it's usually on our top's worst list for the show, and I've never understood why, because Jimmy's too mean. Well, we've seen Jimmy mean before, and everyone was laughing at him, so this is probably what finally set him off. Because the mystery doesn't make sense, I don't think it was supposed to. I always saw it like classic Scooby-Doo, where it's not a mystery as much as a framing device to watch funny gags. Because the episode's too long, I never felt that way. Even if it's double the usual length, the slapstick is so good it never feels like it drags. I love what they do to each kid to compare a footprint they found against theirs. Heck, I love how they're just carrying that sidewalk block with them all throughout the episode. And I love how Jimmy sets up red herrings and underhanded dealings to get back at the Eds. Okay, there are some plot holes when he's explaining himself, but it again shows us how much of Eddy's teachings rubbed off on him. Honestly, I think this is one of the most complex and engaging plots of the show. My only problem is overplay. Not only was this on a DVD I watched endlessly as a kid, but it felt like it was on TV every other day, so I got sick of it. But that doesn't mean it's a bad episode. Honestly, I think it's an above average episode and a good one to make their first double-length feature. Also, the friendship song is one of the most persistent earworms I've heard in my life. If Don't Rain on My Ed isn't the best episode of the show, it's only because it's tied with the later one. The Eds hear that the candy store is giving out free jawbreakers, but they have to hurry since it closes in 10 minutes. The humor and pacing of this episode is amazing. I love how it's one big race against time of the universe. It's not enough that they have to make it in an absurdly short window, but everything that could get there in a way does. Chores, bullies, construction work, bad weather, and their own physical makeups all try to stall them at every opportunity. And unlike Ed or Tails, the fast-paced humor works here, especially since we actually want them to make it to the store. But so many things get in their way, you'll be laughing out of surprise at each of them. Even the cankers get in a good appearance. Heck, everyone gets a chance to shine, and that's another point to the episode. Seeing the whole cast contribute to getting in the Ed's way, and others just how many set pieces are utilized. The Eds race through a lot of Peach Creek to get to the store, so we get to see a good amount of the neighborhood, the construction site, the back fences, and other places that make the scope of this episode huge. Possibly the biggest since On the Eds, and the largest until the movie, which just feels like a precursor to. Even the world feels bigger, especially when they might just make it, and Faith throws both a thunderstorm and a herd of chickens at them. I just can't point out every element that works in the time of the allotted. It's the episode you absolutely have to watch, and tied for finest of the entire show, and the opening with the Science Museum was one of my favorites. Once Bitten, Twice Ed wraps up season 3, but not with dignity. There's a good opening where Ed is playing with his model rocket before we see that his demon figure is alive named Baron O'Beefdip. It turns out Eddy taped a walkie-talkie to its back, which he uses to get Ed to abuse himself, including eating his mattress in one of the funniest visuals of the show, and he almost eats Double D before they find Eddy hiding in the closet. All of this is a lot of fun, which makes it sadder that the rest is one of the worst episodes. Eddy uses the same tactic to get the kids to go to a raccoon theme park where they can bag their own raccoon. Rolf steps up, Johnny gets in the way, everybody leaves, and Eddy decides to tweak everything. So he uses the same tactic to get the kids to go to an alien theme park where they can bag their own alien. Rolf steps up, Johnny gets in the way, everybody leaves, and Eddy decides to tweak everything. And the rest is just everyone being done with this crap, which is what we, the viewing audience, also are. A big fallacy in comedy is assuming that admitting you're not funny automatically makes you funny. It doesn't, it just makes you look more pathetic. And that's what this episode is, pathetic. I don't care if that's the idea, this episode is one of the most painful slogs to sit through. After the opening, I can't think of one good joke or physical gag, making it boring before it's halfway over. Just forget this episode exists and hope we don't see the same mistake next season. And Ed in the Bush starts off season 4, and it's an episode I don't know how I feel about. When Rolf insults Eddy, the Eds follow the Urban Rangers into the woods to ruin their camping trip, before Rolf turns the tables. I made my love for the Urban Rangers known, and the stuff for them is great, especially their spread, which looks exactly like how a group called the Urban Rangers would camp out, and there are a lot of good sight gags, especially the opening with Eddy trying to hog-tie Ed. The episode also gets very ambitious with his animation and shadow work, expertly depicting darker colors for the evening and night scenes depending on the light source, and even having a couple first-person perspectives that are very hard to do in 2D animation. That said, I kinda hate Rolf in this. Eddy only plots revenge because Rolf acts like a pompous ass and insults him right out of nowhere. Yeah, Eddy's celebrating a victory, and the Urban Rangers call him a loser. I throw a tomato at them too, and then there's Rolf going after them for ruining their trip. Yes, they deserve punishment, but all they did was make spooky noises and possibly strand Jimmy in a tree. And for that, they're stalked, trapped, pummeled, and scarred for life. The ending shows that they're traumatized and haven't left Ed's closet in days. I just don't feel the penalty fits a crime. Maybe if we saw them making the Urban Rangers miserable at every turn, I could understand, but all we see are the lights going out at the campsite a mess, which either the Eds or the campers could have done. So I feel sorry for the Eds and angry at Rolf. I guess I don't hate this episode, but it could have been written much better, and I didn't need to see Jimmy trimming his toenails. Seeing how Ed is an intriguing watch for the first viewing. The other kids notice that the Eds are suspiciously absent and take the opportunity to celebrate, but when odd accessories appear in their pottery supplies, they fear the Eds might be plotting something after all. This episode's similar to A Came From Outer Ed, where most of its excitement comes from not knowing the turnout. For most of the runtime, the Eds are nowhere to be found, and it's just the kids looking for them, and finding weird costume parts where they shouldn't be. So there is tension as we wonder what it all means and where the Eds could be. Kevin especially is skeptical as the search goes on, since he's the most social and down-to-earth out of the cast, and often takes the brunt of the Ed scams backfiring. So when they finally find what the Eds were working on, he refuses to be caught up in madness and runs off, and he can understand why. Sadly, outside of the mysteries, there's not much else going on. The laughs are few and far between. I like when Sarah kicks a skateboard ramp to get Jimmy down, showing even she can get impatient with its frail demeanor, but the rest is surprisingly boring once you know what happens. I think it might have been funnier if we didn't see the Eds do any scam. We just have the kids celebrating a lack of Eds for almost the entire runtime, and maybe Kevin could be paranoid, finding clues that don't exist and ruining things for everyone, and we see the Eds were out of town and only return in the last few seconds, having nothing to do with anything. As is, it's a decent episode for the first watch, it doesn't have much to come back to. Still, Rolf's distaste for raisins is something I relate with. Is there an Ed in the house is just okay? Sarah is sick, so Ed takes time away from Eddy's scheming to take care of her, while also competing with Jimmy to be the best caretaker. It's a Sarah episode, so I have to tell you how much I care about her. She's the human equivalent of wood splinters under fingernails, and yeah, she's a colossal brat in this episode as usual, including torturing Double D when he tries to set up a pager system, resulting in him getting sick. But what saves this episode is Ed. I do find it cute, and more than a little sad, that Ed is so dedicated to helping his little sister when she would throw him to the wolves just for laughs. But he's still Ed and has his own ideas of helping, including just bringing the fridge to her when she's hungry and reading her a gory comic when she's bored. At one point, he ties up Jimmy just so he can have Sarah's complete attention, but Jimmy's love for Sarah knows no biting, so it's the constant rivalry between Ed and Jimmy, each trying their hardest to do what they think is best for Sarah, that keeps things entertaining, as well as Eddy's schemes. I think him opening a photo studio, then later of driving school, are two of the more inventive ventures he's come up with, and again, something I would have loved to do, especially since technically the kids got what they paid for and both only failed thanks to Ed's hurry to help Sarah. So this episode's fine, not one of the funniest, not one I revisit often, but good enough for what it's about. Though why is Double D shouting and Naz for not installing a brake on a car she didn't build? And Ed is Born is the other best episode of the entire show. Eddy gets mail from his brother suggesting he's still thought of as a baby, so the Eds make a movie showing how awesome Eddy is. I absolutely love Eddy basically making propaganda, exaggerating his life far beyond believability, including claiming, several planets is the mayor, which even the cameraman continually calls him out on. Speaking of, the camera work is unbelievably good, convincingly portraying a first-person view in a two-dimensional setting, and the Double D is the operator. We'll see minor adjustments as he learns to position it, and subtle reactions to events, like trembling when the cankers appear. Plus static as the camera is turned on and off to switch scenes and angles, and even glitching when it's punched out of his hands. The best visual is where there's a mirror and we see Double D move along with the camera. That is attention to detail. Also, Ed swallows the camera. It's as funny as it sounds. Heck, the humor is some of the show's finest, especially how none of the other kids even try to humor the Eds. Eddy claims Kevin is the neighborhood dork and he gets a wedgie. Eddy tries to assert control of the swings and Ed backstabs him in favor of Sarah. And when Eddy realizes he's not getting any cooperation and tries to disguise Ed as Rolf and create cardboard cutouts of the kids, even they backfire. And the first time I saw Rolf's reaction at the end, I had to go sit in a closet for an hour. I was laughing so hard. Literally everything about this episode is perfect. With too much good to sum up in only a minute. It has to be seen to do it justice. I absolutely love this episode and never get tired of watching it. So how much did it cost to send that crate to Eddy? One size fits Ed has aged very, very strangely. Eddy becomes obsessed with training a sumo wrestler, so he force feeds Jimmy to turn him into a giant, only to find sumo wrestling is a culture-specific sport. Maybe it's the gigabytes upon gigabytes of fetish material I've been forced to scroll through ever since I first started web browsing, but this episode comes across like someone's personal fantasy. Seeing Jimmy as a 1,000-pound behemoth in a diaper gives me the impression I shouldn't be watching this. He even swallows someone, or at the very least Ed gets stuck in his stomach. And there are a lot of other moments that have me tugging on my collar and thinking somebody has some very specific images they've been waiting their whole lives to realize. But even when I watched this as a kid, before I learned just how perverted we are as a species, I never found it that funny. Ed being a sumo wrestler gets a chuckle, especially when he rolls up the sidewalk, but otherwise I didn't even feel like they tried to write jokes. Like they were making a morbidly obese Jimmy being comedy gold. I just don't get the point of this episode. It's quite possible the themes were unintentional, and it's thanks to today's fan art communities that we associate certain feelings with it, but whatever they're thinking, this just wasn't worth trying in the first place. So I like the Ed's wishing well scheme. Those things are scams anyway, so why not have one of their own? Pain in the Ed is an episode I have mixed feelings about. Ed has been assigned violin lessons by his parents and syncs up the neighborhood with his discordant playing, so Eddy decides to destroy the violin. Maybe it's just the future parent in me, but I find it admirable that Ed's parents found out his talent, and they haven't completely given up on him as previous episodes have suggested, and Ed doesn't seem to have a problem with it. If anything, he seems pretty dedicated and could potentially have a future with the instrument, so I admire his commitment, which makes Eddy all the more unlikable. Yeah, I hate Eddy in this one. He wants to smash Ed's violin because it annoys him, which, dude, that's not your violin, which was likely very expensive and finally gives Ed some realistic goals. I'm sure you're gonna find a place somewhere to practice that doesn't affect you or the other kids, but no, he also wants Ed's undivided attention, so he tries to break it at every turn. But it's forwarded by Jimmy, who Sarah has assigned to make sure Ed gets his practice again, and yeah, Jimmy is unconvincing disguises is the funniest running gag. There's also Eddy gluing carpet to his armpits to convince the other kids he's more mature, which isn't that funny, but seeing that Double D also secretly attempted it is. But the best part is where Double D fashions a Rube Goldberg machine in the shape of a statue to accidentally crush Ed's violin, and yeah, this gives one from Animaniacs a run for its money. I love the amount of detail that went in each step and the eventual outcome, so there's a lot I hate, but enough good to watch this episode again, and Ed already has a fan, so I say keep practicing. Ed Overboard is an episode I should hate, but don't. Ed is kidnapped by the cankers, so Double D calls the Urban Rangers to get him back. I hate the opening where we're stuck with the cankers just being gross and unpleasant for 2 minutes, and the whole episode is technically canker-centric, as most of it is just them torturing Ed. That said, there's some really good jokes and routines in this. I love Ed getting his pathetic macaroni art, pretentious names. I love how Rolf calls the other Rangers to help with the reward he promises them, which even for this group seems oddly specific. I love what the other Eds have to go through just to follow them. Heck, I even love Ed's reactions to being tortured, like how he's nonchalantly carried off after gluing himself to the table. Plus his odd descriptors for the cankers and how he alternates between being obliviously blissful and scared out of his mind. There are so many good lines and gags for an episode you wouldn't think deserves this much attention. Practically every 5 seconds, there's another zinger that had me burst out laughing, and Eddy's comment about swearing has become part of my lexicon. And when the Urban Rangers rush to the rescue, well, there's a lot of enjoyment to be had there as well. Especially how Ed botches his own rescue. I don't know what else to say, it's just relentlessly funny and one I frequently watch, though I really wanted to know what the Rangers were going to do at the end. One of those Eds is another fantastically funny episode. The kids find a quarter stuck to the ground and the race is on to see which kid can get it off the sidewalk. This is another reaction episode where we get to see each kid's take toward the same object, except for Naz, who's strangely absent. In fact, this is technically 2 reaction episodes. First we get a routine where everyone sees the quarter hidden under something a previous kid left, starting and ending with Eddy. Then we get to see each kid try to yank the quarter off the cement, and both sections are hilarious. Especially Rolf, who thinks he gets the best laughs in the episode. There's a running gag where his back is crooked thanks to a junk mattress the Ed sold him, and it's fixed and unfixed throughout, which is something I can relate with. There's another where Ed becomes obsessed with shoes, collecting them as they fly off during the scuffles. It doesn't lead anywhere, but it's fun seeing Ed playing with them in the background, and that the animators remember the kids aren't wearing shoes. But yes, the best part is seeing how each kid tries and fails to get the quarter off the ground, which I don't think I'm spoiling anything by revealing nobody succeeds. Even Double D and his over-elaborate digging machine unlocks everything but the quarter. And once it is finally picked up by someone, you'll either be laughing or groaning. It's overall a funny episode and one worth revisiting, and since there's an ambulance, I guess this could count as an adult appearing? They call him Mr. Ed is another absolute favorite of mine. Eddy starts a company. Yeah, that's it, but that's also all it needs. It's in the same vein as Urban Ed or Wish You Were Ed, but this time it's an office simulation. I like those episodes. It's a blast just watching the kids play out different roles in the company. Hiring Naz, Jimmy, Rolf, even Johnny finds a place where he fits in, making this the most inclusively judgmental enterprise I've ever seen. And as the staff grows, so does the company, eventually taking up Eddy's entire yard, again having one of the healthiest growth rates I've seen in business. But what really makes this episode great and possibly even better than the aforementioned episodes is its running gags. It's a company dedicated to the concept of up, so at every opportunity the kids will try to work up into their vocabulary, either stating how things are looking up or just thinking as many puns involving the word up as they can. Not only is it hilarious, but it makes this one of the more positive episodes of the show, giving it a warm aura that makes it more fun to watch. But as the employee morale starts dropping, the word down leads into their vernacular, and the venture fails as that word becomes more prevalent. Again, very reflective of real-world business. And in the background is Ed building an elevator somewhere, which, while already giving us some incredibly funny visual gags, also leads to one of the best endings in the show. Add some consistently funny jokes, and this is one of the greatest episodes of the series. Top 5 easily. Also, the opening is one of the most Ed moments ever. For the Ed by the Ed is an episode I don't know what to do with. Ever serving Jimmy from the Cankers, the kids wants to elect Plank as king of the cold attack, but Eddy becomes his opponent and uses every underhanded technique he knows to undermine Plank's reputation and win the election. I've seen this exact same plot used in a lot of other cartoons, especially when kids are running for class president, and this episode doesn't give me much new in that department. I think every joke about politics has been told at least a million times each, including here. Oh, Eddy wants to unearth a bad photo of Plank and create a scandal? Yeah, I haven't seen that before, or stuffing the ballot box as his own name. I guess it's funny when Eddy tells Ed to dig up some dirt on Plank, and he literally just goes and digs up dirt, but then in that dirt is something he can use against Plank. That's cheap, but also kind of clever, as well as never showing us what it is. I also don't know why the kids immediately reject Eddy's campaign promise to give him all jawbreakers. I mean, besides Eddy's been proven untrustworthy, but if they first looked excited, then Eddy tries passing off something as a fake jawbreaker and everyone gives up on him, that would have been much funnier. And it shouldn't be a shock that Eddy doesn't win. Overall, it's cute and innocent seeing the kids do their interpretation of the election, but just not funny enough to warrant a second watch. If I'm not excited that the Cankers were beaten, you're doing something wrong. Besides, we all know that Ed won the election, not Plank. Little Ed Blue is an episode I want to like more than I do. Typically, Blissful Ed is in a bad mood for some reason, so the other Eds must try to cheer him up. Now, that sounds like a very boring plot, and normally it would be, but there are a lot of good jokes and gags that make up for it. It's worth watching just to see the various faces and death glares Krabby Ed makes towards anyone who invades his space, and especially him finally getting Sarah to back off. And when Eddy and Double D are trying to make him happy, he employs a different way each time to cram their efforts down their throats, sometimes literally. Let's face it, we've all been in Ed's shoes, where we're grumpy and we want to be left alone, and we either want to or maybe even did things like this to anyone who dared to invade our space. So his actions, as well as comical, are completely understandable. The comic gag is one of the best in the show, and we get to see what Baron O'Beef Tip's action feature is. I was also really into the opening where we see the kids watching a caveman movie the Eds made, which I'm surprised was never the subject of a full episode, and Ed's rampage at the end is a lot of fun, even if the ending is very anticlimactic. My reasons for not enjoying this episode are admittedly personal. I grew up in a large family where everyone, including my parents, had anger management issues, so people screaming and telling others to shut up and get over it, like that's ever helped with a temper tantrum, gives me post-traumatic cringe and makes this episode literally painful to sit through. But it's still very funny and interesting to see Ed in a different light, and I'm sure there's some publisher somewhere that prints that kind of magazine. A twist of Ed isn't bad, but I can't stand it. The Eds are fed up with the Cankers' constant abuse, so they try to repel them by pretending to love them and creeping them out. This is another plot that's basically one joke, and one I've seen in many other cartoons and sitcoms, where in order for a character to get rid of an unwanted love interest, they have to reciprocate their affection dial up to 11, and I don't think I've ever liked this plot in any show. It's like dim-lit Ed. The status quo is God, so if there's a character set up to be the yandere, we know attempts to make them stop will fail, and they'll be back to this routine in my next episode. Which is the case here, and the situation's not funny enough to make sitting through this predictable plot worth it. They don't stumble across the idea to use reverse psychology until halfway through, so that's a lot of runtime wasted, and while the Cankers' confused reactions almost get a laugh, they're not big or violent enough to truly be funny. If anything, you start to feel the awkwardness they're going through, which ruins any schadenfreude we might have had seeing the Cankers tortured for once. And like I said, they win in the end anyway, making it all feel pointless. The only saving grace is Ed. Literally everything he says or does here is hilarious. Every time I ask for a spoon, I say it the way he says it. And I like Double D realizing why there's lipstick on his long right before getting tackled by Marie. But these moments don't add up to an enjoyable episode. Maybe if you haven't seen this routine a million times, you might like it, but it's not one I care for, especially since Lee ambushing Eddy in the shower is a million flavors of disturbing. Your Ed here is an episode you've probably been waiting for me to get to. Kevin finds Eddy's wallet and his middle name is Skipper, so to keep it secret, Eddy has to agree to everything Kevin tells him to do, no matter how humiliating it is. This episode is infamous, with some fans calling it the worst episode of the series, and yeah, it's bad. Really bad. For the same reason Bunny Your Ed was bad. All it is watching Eddy get tortured for no reason. He has nothing to repent for. Heck, his opening scheme is actually legit and pretty interesting. It's just straight up bullying from Kevin. I stood up for Kevin back in season 2, even calling him likable to a degree, but I have noticed he's gotten worse since then, at times even going out of his way to make the Eds miserable. And it's either here or the later Smile for the Ed where Kevin's at his worst. You just feel so sorry for Eddy, who's forced to hand over his money just like Jimmy, eat a raw fish, and even kiss Double D on the mouth in front of the kids. Which, okay, there's bullying and then there's pure evil. None of this is fun to watch. We've had episodes that actually made someone getting tortured funny, but this isn't one of them. It's just pure misery. Especially since Kevin tells everyone his name anyway, and they all mock him mercilessly for it. Which, if this doesn't get the Carrie ending, makes this one of the worst episodes of the entire show. Spoilers, it doesn't. And as the finishing blow, Double D tells Eddy his middle name in secret, and Eddy screams it to the kids, meaning all sympathy he garnered is shredded, and this was truly a waste of time. There are some good gags, but nothing can salvage this episode. It's not the worst, but it's definitely bottom 5. The Good Old Ed is an episode I don't like as much as I did. Double D is putting together a time capsule and filling with the memories of their many misadventures, but some of the Eds have different recollections than others. Once upon a time, this was one of my favorite episodes. I loved what it was basically a look back on the show and a reminder of the iconic props of any end episode. The Canadian squirt gun, the Hypno wheel, the Eddy doll, all good memories of the show. But then the episode takes a turn when they start pulling out items featuring episodes that technically never existed, like building a time machine, making a giant pancake, or Double D getting the hiccups. Yeah, this is one of those fake clip show episodes, which by this point have become just as cliche as regular clip shows. Heck, seeing as how on-demand services make the concept of a clip show obsolete years ago, I don't think anyone knows what they're parodying to begin with anymore. Now, to the episode's credit, the segments are pretty enjoyable, if a little light on laughs. It's just how tired I am of clip shows, real or fake, that has knocked this episode from grace. I actually would have preferred it if just about the Eds talking about past episodes, bringing up remember this, remember this, remember this, and quizzing veteran viewers on where each item came from. I don't know if that would have been entertaining for 11 minutes, but they could have found some way, and this episode just ends with Eddy getting frustrated and telling them to stop remembering. Again, this episode's not bad, I'm just personally tired of it. Also, I don't think Eddy deserved a beating, all because the kids got in his way of the giant pancake. Thick as an Ed is a really good opening. After being woken up by Sarah, Ed falls asleep again right outside of his house. Then we get to see one of his dreams where everything is colored in crayon, which after Rockabye Ed, I guess shows what Ed's good dreams look like. It's really fun. It reminds me of an episode of Bluey. Sadly, the rest of the episode is nowhere near as creative. The Eds want to catch frogs, but Ed smells worse than usual thanks to an incredibly moldy cheese wedge he's affectionately named Sheldon. Double D refuses to work until they get rid of it, and the rest of the episode is just them trying to wrestle it from Ed. Now, to be fair, this episode is pretty funny. In fact, it's one of the rare instances where Double D gets the most laughs. I love his reactions every time he comes into contact with the cheese, either having a unique physical response or just screaming out the top of his lungs. Again, it's an example of how someone in misery can still be funny, as well as how well the show handles gross out humor. The show is smart and knows that humor comes from the reaction to something gross, not the gross thing itself, something you'll sadly forget later. I also like the various ways Eddy tries to get Ed's jacket, including suggesting the flight as a flag for a nation of zombies, but the best part is Double D and Ed arguing. Double D coming up with various verbose insults for Ed, and Ed simply responding with stinky hat each time, which has become my go-to response for ridiculous put down. So while I don't like this episode as a whole, it has some very standout moments that keep me coming back. Also, press F to pay respects to all the fish. Sorry, wrong Ed may be the most divisive episode in the series. Eddy takes the phone Rolf is throwing out, but the phone starts ringing, and every time it's answered, something unfortunate befalls Eddy. According to the fan base, this is either one of the funniest things you've seen or you hate its guts, and sadly I'm the latter. I hate this episode. This is one of the stupidest forced plots in the entire series. First of all, while the show's tone is cartoonish, its setting is still grounded in reality, so a magic phone fits in as well as a genie as it's told by Ginger. Second, the solution is obvious. Just don't pick up the receiver, or even better, destroy it, smash it, bury it, at very least cut the cord. If you know the phone hurts you every time you answer, then don't answer it. This episode is dependent on everyone being brain dead stupid. And speaking of, third and most glaringly, Double D is horrible. He goes the entire episode screaming at Eddy that the phone's not cursed while doing absolutely nothing to prove his point. Even when Eddy's getting pummeled, he doesn't even lift a finger and just makes snide remarks. They get Eddy's and Double D's scripts around. We've seen him act out of character before, but this is inexcusable. Especially the ending where Eddy is repeatedly beaten on and all Double D can do is smile and gloat. Even Eddy hasn't made me want to punch a character more than this. Admittedly, a lot of Ed's lines and the way Eddy is tortured are funny, but everyone's stupidity and Double D's uncharacteristically callous attitude ruins any enjoyment to be had. Just stay away from this episode and watch Read All About Ed. Sure, that's also a terrible episode, but at least Double D is in character for it. Robin Ed is odd, just odd. When the kids are burned by one of Eddy's more malicious scams, Captain Melonhead ambushes Eddy and returns their money. So Eddy swears vengeance on the mysterious masked man. Also, do you notice Johnny and Melonhead are never in the same place at the same time? First of all, I don't think Captain Melonhead was needed. This is one of the most pathetic scams Eddy has ever pulled, and the other kids have beaten him up and gotten a refund for less. And second, like the last episode, this plot just feels wrong to the show. It's a superhero battle between Johnny and Eddy. Oh, I'm sorry, Professor Scam, which I'm not opposed to, but it takes itself way too seriously. Unlike episodes like Know It All Ed that has characters acting like they're in a different environment but still aware they're just playing, this episode actually wants to depict superheroes. To the point they try to have superpowers. Eddy has a mind ray and Johnny has instant grow acorns, and it's treated like no big deal, with most of the kids' dialogue like something out of Ed's comics. If Eddy and Johnny were role-playing superheroes and we saw all this through Ed's mind, completely with a different animation style and a switch back and forth between fantasy and reality, that might have worked. But this just doesn't fit the show. The best part is Double D, who in every shot looks like he's realized the entire neighborhood is finally cracked, and with how cringy this episode is, I relate to him 100%. I guess it's technically not a bad episode, and maybe someone less nitpicky than me will enjoy it, but it's another plot they really needed to rethink. Though I guess Captain Melonhead made an impact as he's used again for the movie. A Case of Ed is a really bad episode with really good elements. Double D thinks he's sick and the Eds further his delusions, hoping he'll give all his stuff to them. This is another episode where Eddy is absolutely horrible. Double D reads about a disease in a book he just bought and convincing himself he has one of the more fatal diseases, and the others have no problem scaring him out of his mind and making him feel worse. And like Mama's little Ed, Ed and Eddy are terrible people, but Double D should know better, taking Ed's word, yes, Ed's word, that he's dying and should give away his possessions. When she even starts doing this should be one of the stupidest episodes of the show. He's sitting alongside Sorry Wrong Ed is the worst of Double D. However, there are two things that are redeeming in my eyes. First, Ed playing doctor. What he does to diagnose Double D is really funny, down to everything he says and the fact he straight up eats one of his shoes. And the second is all the stuff with Kevin. He's been grounded and can't leave his house, so Ed and Eddy relentlessly torture him outside, and Ed's toe puppet show is one of my favorite gags in the series. But it all comes around and Kevin is let off for good behavior and ready to pound the Eds, and unlike Mama's little Ed, the punishment fits the crime, with Double D realizing he's been tricked, more than happy to help. I should hate this episode, but it has a lot of good humor and a great payoff to everything, and the parts that aren't great can just be skipped with nothing lost. So don't read too much into Rolf bringing an eggplant to the beach. Run for Your Ed may be the best canker-centric episode of the show. Ed's been sleep-eating again, but this time he's accidentally stolen the canker's prize heirloom of a ship in the bottle, so it's a race against time to get it off Ed's finger before the cankers completely demolish the neighborhood. This episode finally depicts the cankers as how they should be, not as abusive love interest for the Eds, but unstoppable forces of nature that must be avoided or satiated at any cost, because when they're a destructive force, they give Ed a run for his money. The build-up is incredible, showing Rolf as an animal is the first to sense danger before the cankers show up and the earth is literally torn asunder with their rage, but even more brilliant is that the Eds are oblivious to the cataclysm occurring outside, focused on getting the bottle unstuck just because it's annoying. And yes, this is just so, but Ed is hygiene phobic and it goes nowhere. So scenes will alternate between the cankers trashing the neighborhood and torturing the kids and the Eds just trying to help Ed, even just barely missing each other until the arcs finally collide. There's a full 20 seconds of near silence as Double D slowly puts two and two together with his heartbeat intensifying throughout before he finally blurts out while the cankers are at his door. And it's one of the funniest moments of pure tension I've ever seen in a cartoon, and once the cankers find the bottle, well, that's all they wanted and they leave. Even Double D comments on how they managed to avoid their affections. While it's not a favorite, I still recognize this as one of the best episodes of the show, and finally one where I'm not cringing at the mere sight of the cankers. Also, their Three Stooges snoring routine is hilarious. Hand-me-down Ed is the better version of Sorry Wrong Ed. A boomerang suddenly flies into the neighborhood and anyone who touches it suddenly has the personality reversed. So this has the exact same problem as Sorry Wrong Ed. Mystical items just don't fit in this more down-to-earth setting. It's like mixing Abraham Lincoln with vampires. Oh wait, that actually kind of worked, but I digress. That said, unlike Sorry Wrong Ed, this episode is pretty fun to watch. It's another reaction episode where most of the kids pick up the boomerang for different reasons and instantly have the characteristics turn on their head. Jimmy becomes a statistic muscle man, Sarah becomes sickly sweet, Ed is smart, Ed is caring, and so on. And that's really all that happens. Eddie's trying to work on a scam where he smells snake oil, but it's barely a framing device. But like Mirror Mirror on the Ed, it's just fun seeing these characters running around acting completely contrary to who they are, even if it does start to get old and we're waiting for a point that never arrives. In fact, it just ends. Probably the funniest transformation is Rolf, who goes from an old world farmer to, God, I don't even know. His culture is so strange, even the opposite of what he's supposed to be is indeterminable. Also, he's aware of the change, suggesting he might know of the magic and what's happening to him and the others, if it's never followed up on. I have nothing else to add, it's just funny for the sake of funny and one of the better received episodes. At the very least, Double E isn't screaming at the top of his lungs that boomerangs are magical. Step Up or Ed is cute and nothing else. Jimmy and Sarah start a rich club and everyone is invited except the Ed, so Eddy, wanting to be included, tries everything he can to be noticed. This is another one I forget even exists. Most of the runtime is just Jimmy and Sarah acting upper class and snobbish and the Ed's trying to join in, and it feels like the same joke over and over again. The Ed's trying to get attention and they're ignored. That's it, until the end where they're let in but only servants to the others. I guess the draw is how the kids interpret being rich and what they use to show it. Like having a yacht race in an inflatable pool or playing croquet on rocking horses. That's cute, it's not funny, but it's inventive. The best part is the opening, where Eddy's trying to sell bubble wrap and disguises himself as other kids to drum up interest. Which, I pity his voice actors' vocal cords. But besides that, maybe two headlines and this model ship they build, I just don't see any reason to watch this episode. This is gonna end up my shortest video because I have literally nothing else to say, but if Rolf won't eat that platter, I will. Here's my new Ed, might be Eddy. What Sorry Wrong Ed was to Double D. Jimmy's having a bad day, so Eddy promises to fix his mood, but when Eddy screws him over, Jimmy teams with Rolf to get him back. Now, Eddy's no saint with brain trust, that has been proven, but here he cheats Jimmy out of his money for a theme park that doesn't exist. Holy hell, that's evil, and arguably the worst thing he's ever done. Yeah, it doesn't matter what his punishment is, it's one of those episodes that can destroy a character. Like Teen Titans, The Beast Within. He's not coming back from this one, and the rest isn't any better for him. He's tricked by Jimmy and Rolf into trading everything he owns for a money tree seed, and even for Eddy, he's fooled too easily. Even completely ignoring Double D pointing out it's a fake. I'm surprised he even catches on that it's not a seed, and technically he doesn't, because after he realizes the first one is fake, he demands the real one is given a screw and completely falls for it. Even Ed points out even he's not that dumb. This is nowhere near as bad as Double D's worst episodes, as Eddy doesn't have much grace to fall from, but Eddy feels like a character of himself. I'd say it feels like bad fan fiction, but it technically is, as the idea is credited to Kit Top of the then popular fansite Edtropolis, so don't get fans to write your material. That said, I do like Jimmy and Rolf getting along, with Jimmy almost turning parasitic, and I'm glad Eddy doesn't get screwed over for what he did. And Ed gets some good lines, especially with his Double D puppet, but I'm just cringing too hard to like this episode. Also, Double D should know there was no park, as Eddy didn't have him build it. Stuck in Ed is the show's 100th episode, and they celebrate with a change-up, kind of. For the first time ever, Eddy can't think of a scam, so he hires Jimmy to think of one for him, and is stuck gathering supplies for whatever the kid is planning. So yeah, not the most original plot for a 100th episode. We already had one already, teaches Jimmy the art of the scam, and he proves to be better than him. In fact, they bring that up in this very episode, so we already know what happens, we just don't know how it happens. Jimmy asks for some seemingly random supplies, and we watch the Eds get them, wondering where it's all leading to, which is very similar to It Came From Outer Ed, but the search and end result are nowhere near as chaotic or entertaining. And just like Ed in a half shell, Jimmy reveals all, but Eddy doesn't like it and ditches him, only for Jimmy to make out like a bandit. The end. Pretty underwhelming for a milestone, but that's assuming this was intended as the 100th episode and did just air as it. Personally, I would would have had the good old Ed for the 100th, as a clip show parody feels more like a celebration episode. That said, this episode has its moments. Johnny's penny dance is something I emulate, how they get each refrigerator is creative, and dare I ask what died in Rolf's wall? But ultimately, this episode is just okay. It could have aired as the 64th episode and made as much impact. Still, well done making it to this milestone. Most shows don't even get this lucky. Postcards from the Ed is another of my favorite openings. I freaking love the Sphinx they build out of cardboard and the hours and hours it must have taken to decorate the interiors. I even love the name King Tucker Sheridan. This is something else I would have wanted to build as a kid, and if someone else in the area had, I most definitely would have been a friend. It's another scheme I really wish succeeded and one I'm sad to see destroyed, and the rest is surprisingly not as creative given the idea. Plank's parents are visiting the neighborhood and the Eds volunteer to show them around. But Eddy goes rogue and takes them on a premium tour, charging each and every expense to Johnny. You'd think an episode with that premise would be more interesting, and while it's not terrible, it mostly boils down to one joke. Eddy pretends to be a tour guide and bilks Johnny for every stop, while the other Eds chase him down, but it's not a bad joke and worth chuckling over just for the sheer ridiculousness of the situation. And it's cute that not only did Johnny create parents for Plank, but the Eds humor him by taking him off his hands. I also like how Eddy at first doesn't want anything to do with them and we follow him just lounging around before suddenly realizing he can be a tour guide. And I'll admit, the episode gets bizarrely dark. This is something that would have scarred me as a kid if network promo didn't spoil it for me, so it's not the best episode and I would have preferred if they did more of the mummy theme, but it's memorable and fun to watch. And anyone who puts that much effort into building a cardboard bus can take all my money. Take This Ed and Shove It is the finale to Season 4 and originally the end of the series. The kids of Peach Creek are growing up, so the Eds try to help them realize their lot in life. And for Eddy, who refuses to grow up, the future may hold more for him than he realizes. This is another double-length episode, but it has multiple sections. The first has the Eds realize the kids are growing out of things, especially after a botched scam that looks like a public access preschool show. The second shows the Eds starting a career counseling service where Ed, their computer, determines their vocation, some reasonable and some bizarre. The third is the kids and living out their jobs, all where Eddy is trying to enjoy his job breakers. And the fourth is where Eddy has a vision in the neighborhood and all the kids 90 years in the future. And this is one of the most famous moments of the show, where even Eddy has to come to terms with the reality of growing older. While this is a beloved episode, it's not one of my favorites. One problem is that the kids as seniors aren't that much different than how they are young, except for Rolf, who has completely lost it, though it could be interpreted as how things can change and stay the same. And two, the episode's not that funny. There are phony moments, but nothing that stands out, except for Ed complaining about his incontinence, unfortunately. That said, this is a fine episode that addresses the importance of enjoying life while you're young and appreciating the friends who will grow older with you. And if it actually was the final episode, it's a good one to end things on. Also check out the deleted scenes if you can. After Season 4, they produced several holiday specials while awaiting the show's future, and the first is the Christmas special, Jingle Jingle Jangle. Yeah, the specials don't get Ed puns. Eddy finds he's just getting clothes for Christmas, so he tries to get the other kids to adopt him so he'll get their presents. If you follow that reasoning, I envy you. This is a double-length episode, as are all the specials, and unfortunately it feels like it's mostly just Eddy going to each of the kids, trying to get them to give him a present and either being driven out or given up. And it does start to drag, but we do get to see how each kid celebrates, with most being regular Christmas and some having their own traditions, with Rolf's, of course, being the most unique. I don't think his holiday song will ever leave my head. There are even crackers, pretty uncommon for an American show, and there are a lot of good laughs and visuals. There's Ed destroying his house just to put the chimney in his room, Eddy's increasingly pathetic excuses why the other kids should adopt him, Johnny's elaborate escape slide that he just so happens to have under his house, and the fact Kevin has a portal gun. The third act, I think, is trying to parody Christmas specials where Eddy fixes his tree and everyone makes a big deal about it, and Double D tries to connect it with what Christmas is all about, but Eddy steals all the presents so nothing's learned. Actually, I can't believe I'm saying this. I think the cankers are the best part. They have some good laughs at the beginning on a seemingly random mark, but once you see where it's leading and how everything fits together, it's one of the best and gags of the series. Overall, while it drags the points, this is a good time and probably the best of the holiday specials, though shouldn't the parents be here? It's Christmas Eve in the middle of the night. The Valentine's special, Hanky Panky Hubaloo, is weird. Yeah, even for this show. May Canker is upset she's nobody's Valentine's and Double D gives her his out of guilt. And then Sarah and Jimmy, who are actual cherubs for some reason, strike them with arrows and they fall head over heels in love with each other. And that's the gag. May and Double D stare longingly at each other while random chaos happens in the background. Again, for twice as long as the usual runtime. The writing feels especially odd here. Why is May upset Ed rejected her when she already had no concept of consent? Why is she suddenly a science major? Why is Double D so mean to Eddy at the end? And most importantly, why are Jimmy and Sarah little pixies with the power of Cupid? It's like it was written by someone who just joined the staff, except it's still the show's usual team. Maybe they thought they were trying some new things for the next season, or maybe they thought the show was canceled, so who cares what they did? Either way, most of what happens is never mentioned again. It's not that funny either. Most of the humor feels random. There's Eddy's kissing booth, there's him climbing up a rope, there's him trying to forge money, and other things that sometimes get a laugh, but mostly take a backseat to watching May and Double D fawn over each other. The ending is the best part, where brawl breaks out. Sarah and Jimmy try to fix it by making everyone fall in love, and Rolf, the only one aware of their presence, crushes them and cures everyone by splashing them with mop water, and not a single thing was lost. The really notable aspect is that this is the first appearance of the kids in school, which would become the setting of Season 5, and besides some small tweaks, it would be how it appears later. I guess the special isn't horrible, it's just mostly pointless, so like most Valentine's specials. The Halloween special Boo Ha Ha is one I don't like as much as I did. Ed's horror movie marathon takes its toll on his mind, and he starts hallucinating everyone as evil monsters whom he proceeds to beat senseless whether they deserve it or not, mostly not. The best part of the special is how creative it looks. Ed gives each kid a unique monster design based on how he interprets their costumes and personalities, and each one memorably stands out. But even better is the landscape of Ed's hallucinations, which look like something from Psychonauts, very flat and angular with loud colors like a cheap stage props made out of cardboard. Fitting for Ed's B-movie obsessed mind, right down to the grindhouse filter that intentionally makes these sequences look grimy and shot on cheap deteriorating film, and Ed's eye static that signals each fantasy. This might be the most visually interesting episode of the whole show, and you can see why it's one of the creators' favorites, but after visuals wear off, the episode is pretty miserable. The whole plot is that Ed has a mental breakdown and ruins Halloween for all the kids. Kids are just minding their business, celebrating, all while Eddie's following his brother's map to allegedly the best place to trick-or-treat, which you'd think he'd learn his lesson after the previous map, but I guess not. And what a surprise, this map turned out to be fake as well, and then Ed traps them all in a hole, preventing them from trick-or-treating right before the kids find them and beat everyone but Ed, who just sips the blue biscuit to the side. So yeah, this episode's pretty mean-spirited, and besides the absurdity of Ed, not even that funny. I guess it's good for one watch, but despite impressive visuals, doesn't give much reason to come back. And where did Ed get that steak? Out with the old, in with the edited double length that starts off season 5. I'm kind of cheating because this wasn't the first one to be aired or produced, but it sets up the season, so why not start with it? It's the end of summer, but the Eds aren't having it, scamming kids until the last possible minute, but even they have to admit defeat and start the new school year. Some fans say the school season is where the show gave up, but I disagree. I think it's a great new setting for some fresh material, which the show is in desperate need of. However, this episode is a good example of the season's overall quality. The first half is great, with Ed and Eddie's elaborate ruse to trick the kids into thinking it's still summer, followed by everyone's mad rush for school supplies once the jig is up. There's some great gags, great lines, and Double D's house is now straight out of the Jetsons. The season also has a slightly different art style and color palette, indicating its switch from Celadon to digital, which I've seen complaints about, but I think it's an overdue update. The second half is pretty bad. The Eds find they're assigned different classrooms, so they have to bargain with the cankers to get the same homeroom. It's as painful as it sounds, and the cankers end up winning, which I guess is here to show that despite a new setting, the series still has its tried and true routine. And that's this season. When it's good, it's really good. When it's bad, it's some of the show's worst. So your taste for the season will probably depend on your reaction to this episode. Me, I think this is a great kickoff for another great season, and here's to a new year, new laughs, and some old ones. Mission Impossible is an episode I really like but really bugs me. It's report card day, and due to how abysmal Ed and Eddie's are, Double E is assigned to deliver them straight to their parents, and once Ed and Eddie find out, the race is on to deliver them before they catch them. In terms of physical comedy, this is one of the best. The pacing is brilliant, even from the first second, just seeing the kids excited for the grade, surprisingly giving me a warm feeling. Then Ed and Eddie finds Double E's being assigned to delivering their report cards, and they try to alter them, and Double E steals them back, and then there's an uncomfortable 30 seconds where Ed and Eddie are waiting for the bell so they can jump him, followed by Double E sneaking out early and trying to get out before everyone else. From there, it's one big race back to the neighborhood with some of the finest side gags and fast-paced humor since Silver Rain on my head, and like that episode, I can't name every single good line or gag found here in under a minute. Even the cankers get a good appearance, and the twist in the end is brilliant. The only thing keeping me from loving this episode is that, like Ed or Tails, it's again the Eds pitted against each other. They're like the Three Stooges. There's something wrong about seeing them separated or against each other. It throws off the balance. I want Double D to succeed, but I feel guilty when he does, especially since he has to face his friends later. And it doesn't end well for him anyway. Also, this pit trap is here's money to your Ed levels of way too stupid Eddie. Still, I really do like this episode. I watch it all the time, and someone less hung up on details might even love it. And we finally see the kids' parents, or at least what's within arm's reach. Every Which Way But Ed could be the spiritual sequel to 1 + 1 = Ed. Eddie starts telling the story of how he got a jawbreaker from Johnny, only for Johnny to start telling a story, only for Nance to start telling a story, and soon the Eds are stuck in flashback purgatory. I hesitate to call this one as good as 1 + 1 = Ed. That one is more surreal and had a more natural progression, with the Eds' obsession to learn how things work, leading them to disassemble the laws of the world and break the universe. Here, some of the kids just do the cartoon gag of pulling on the side of the screen to introduce a flashback, and suddenly the Eds just appear in Rolf's memory, which are the other kids aware of this? I don't know. That said, this one is still very funny and answers questions we didn't know we had. The opening with Double D teaching Ed about static electricity, only for it to literally blow up in his face, is one of the most famous moments of the show, and we get to see where Plank got that splinter and maybe why he displays sociopathic tendencies. Though now his fat jokes haven't aged well, and the Eds trying to remember themselves back to reality only to constantly get distracted deserves a lot of laughs. My only issue is pacing. After the opening, the Eds disappear until over halfway through the episode, and them trying to remember where they were mostly feels like padding. Until the ending, which is pretty funny, but another one that just ends. So while I prefer the other episode, this is still very creative, one of the best of the season, and Kevin once had hair, who knew? Boom Boom Out Goes the Ed is an episode I think is okay. A power outage strikes the neighborhood, leaving the kids in darkness. Not helping is Ed, who blames the event on evil mole mutants, causing panic to erupt and chaos to rule. While this episode isn't bad, it doesn't feel like an Ed and Eddie episode. It's hard to explain. The humor is much more calm and laid back than a typical episode. Yes, I'm saying this about a plot involving mole mutants. The physical comedy isn't as wild as a typical episode, with fewer cartoonish gags and expression, and with a little bit of rewriting, this probably would have worked as an episode of Camp Lazlo, or some other cartoon that relies more on exaggerated visuals than slapstick. The two major running gags are, of course, Ed blaming the event on mutants at every opportunity, and Rolf and Kevin attempt to use a generator to power their TV, again showing Rolf's brutal management skills seen in Will Work for Ed. Besides that, I really am struggling to think of more to say. I guess Double D constantly repositioning himself so he remains in the beam of the flashlight is funny, and Eddie comes very, very close to finally cashing out. My favorite moment is when the lights first go out and it's represented by the characters literally being drawn in black and white, but this episode is surprisingly gross, with a good chunk taking place in the sewer and Double D getting covered in sewage. Though in the show's typical fashion, not enough attention is called to it to make it truly gross, thankfully. I guess in the end, this is an okay episode, but not one I watch often. Still, Eddie's statement that Ed has buttered toast for her brain is finally confirmed. Cleanliness is next to Edness. This is it. The worst. The absolute worst episode of the entire series. Double E wants a shower to start his day, but his bathroom is being remodeled, and everywhere he goes he's turned down and made dirtier and dirtier until he finally snaps. As we've seen, the show is no stranger to gross out humor. Many jokes usually involving Ed revolve around something disgusting happening or being shown. However, the show is smart and even unique in that it knew that humor doesn't come from the gross thing, but everyone's reactions to the gross thing. We're not laughing because Double D gets covered in Ed's spoiled lunch. We're laughing because Double D is reacting to be covered in Ed's spoiled lunch. Here, no. The entire joke is that Double D is getting covered in gross stuff. A lot of gross stuff. Leaves, ketchup, garbage, even emotive animal feces. Yes, they go go there. Even ignoring Double D, this episode seems to go out of its way to be as unappealing as possible, especially with Jimmy still on, Naz's underwear, and Eddy taping a nudity magazine to his window. And when Double D finally gets a bath, it's clear he's going to suffer greatly. Absolutely nothing about this is funny. Everything is unbearably gross, and Double D is in too much misery to laugh at. I can't even begin to tell you how much I hate this episode. I don't just recommend you skip it, but if you own it, delete it. However, to its credit, it took 5 seasons and over 100 episodes for the show to finally resort to this, and this is the only one of its kind. It's nothing compared to what the Powerpuff Girls are doing in their 5th season. I'm Curious Ed is another completely worthless episode. Jimmy and Sarah's fish have babies, and they ask the other kids where babies come from. That's it. They go to a kid and ask them, and they either also don't know or they don't give a straight answer. It's not funny, it goes nowhere. The only notable thing is that after See No Ed, this is the only other episode not to prominently feature the Ed. Sarah and Jimmy visit every other kid before finally running into the Eds halfway through the episode. Oh, while there was a plot point in the other episode, here it's like they just forgot what show they were writing for. On top of that, I never liked this plot. It feels like every other kid's animated sitcom has had an episode where a young kid asks where babies come from. Heck, even Bluey had one, and these kids always seem too old to not know the answer. I don't remember a time when I didn't know how the process worked. It's never too early to teach your kids the truth. Go get them a copy of Where Did I Come From already. But I digress. There are a couple good visual gags, like Eddy running into a garage door and Ed literally flying off with Eddy, but they feel wasted in this barely a plot. And we never get an answer. Jimmy and Sarah just get bored and leave, which is what I felt like doing while watching this. You'll have missed nothing if you choose to skip this episode. This one was stillborn and should have been aborted. Now, Speak to Ed is an episode I probably shouldn't like. The kids get international pen pals, and Ed in particular seems incredibly generous, but each present he receives seems to awaken traumatic memories in Rolf, who becomes more and more paranoid that Ed is more malicious than his brainless state suggests. So the problem is the same as Ed and Ed in the Bush. Rolf is a complete jerk. Every time Ed gets something, Rolf breaks it or beats Ed mercilessly, who for once did absolutely nothing to deserve it. It gets to the point he kidnaps Ed and literally tortures him in a dungeon, and when it's revealed they were all recipients of an elaborate prank, he has them mailed to Norway. Again, the Eds did nothing to deserve any of this, and they're punished for it. I guess why I like this episode is because of how seriously it's taken. Rolf legitimately seems traumatized and desperate to get to the bottom of whatever's going on, but it's hilarious seeing Ed respond by just being his usual oblivious self, therefore completely immune to Rolf's methods. I also like the build-up, running why Rolf is having such aversions to Ed's gifts and learning that Ed and Rolf weren't the only victims in the prank. This flashback to Rolf's childhood is also hilariously dramatic, but my favorite part is Eddy trying to scam his pen pal, who shares the same name and nationality with storyboard artist with fake moon rocks, which he succeeds in, but then can't do anything with Korean money, and I guess they're not aware of currency exchange. So this is technically a bad episode, but it has good elements that keep me coming back in. I wish international mail worked this fast in real life. Cool Hand Ed is an episode I really do want to like. Eddy wants to leave school early, so they stage an elaborate getaway, one that Johnny finds out about, and they must include a risk being caught. As suggested by the title, it's a send up to prison escape movies, just with the setting switch to a school, which I swear every other school-centered show also did at least once. They even discuss their plans during PE, like it's a prison yard, and yeah, they go through every single prison escape cliche, like hiding silverware under their shirts, avoiding teachers like guards, and building something to escape with, in this case a plane. Which, why do they need a plane? Are the doors locked? They can't just run out if they're set on running away, and like Three Squares and Ed, what was their ultimate plan? They escape school, but that just means they're gonna be in trouble when they have to go back. Yeah, I don't get this episode, but what impresses me is how quiet it is. Besides the initial planning and where they're building and flying the plane, there's barely any talking. It's either showing just how mind-numbingly monotonous school can be, or them sneaking around stealing things to build the plane. And once their cover is blown, it's a mad dash to freedom and some fun visuals of them actually flying a plane, which unfortunately ends with possibly the most anticlimactic ending in the entire show. Plan fails and they end up back at school right on time for the bell to sound. If we saw them land in detention, or even better, school was let out early and they could have gone home hours ago, that would have made this ending hilarious. As is, this is just an okay episode with a lot of unanswered questions, like why was Ed so interested in Kevin's outfit if we never see him with it? Too smart for his own Ed is another episode I just don't get. Ed Fluke wins a spelling bee and suddenly everyone thinks he's a genius, asking for his help instead of Double D's, and getting what they deserve. The first bit where we're seeing the kids practicing for the spelling bee and eventually participating is pretty funny. I like how everyone's prepping themselves and teasing how they'll eventually do, with Rolf not being in the ballpark and Eddy stuffing dictionary pages in Ed's head. And it is a shock when Ed gets not one but 2 words correct and Double D's the one to flub up, especially after you had to correct Naz's pronunciation of each word. So the first act is surprisingly fun to watch, but afterwards when Eddy tries to exploit Ed's newfound respect for cash, it becomes monotonous and facepalming with barely any jokes. This is another plot I've seen in practically every cartoon of the time. In fact, with just a slight rewrite, it could have fit into any of said cartoons. We know Ed's gonna mess up, the kids are gonna turn on Eddy, and status quo will be restored, so why are we even watching this? The only entertaining part from this point on is Johnny, who blames Naz for playing not winning the spelling bee, and is setting up stupidly simple traps for some reason. I don't know. When he finally catches Naz, he just lets her go, so that also led nowhere. This episode's not terrible, as much as just boring and predictable, lagging most of the show's trademark humor in favor of a cliche Saturday morning cartoon plot. Though it is fun to pause the episode and see how Ed answers everyone's homework. Who's Minding the Ed is an episode dependent on its absurdity. Rolf leaves for a family reunion and puts Ed in charge of his livestock, a dream come true for the chicken-obsessed kid, and the rest is just Ed doing random things with the animals, which if you find that funny, then great. If not, you're really not gonna like this episode. There's a running gag where Ed pulls a flute out of his head so he can lead the animals like the Pied Piper, and another where he's trying to hide the animals from Sarah so she won't tattle on him, but it ultimately just feels like stuff happening. The rhythms of comedy with no punchline or payoff. I do like the opening where they trick Johnny into distracting Kevin so they can jump in his pile of leaves, and Ed's sad face and waterfalls of tears after Rolf reclaims his animals. But the best gag is where Ed's room fills with water, so when Sarah opens the doors and a really long pause with the Eds just stand there waving to Sarah before the water rushes out and floods the basement. That was funny, which is more than can be said for most of the runtime. Also, things don't end well for Double D, despite having nothing to do with the plot otherwise. I have little to say about this episode because this episode gives me little to work with. It just feels like it's there to be there, and if you skip it or forget it you saw it, you are missing nothing. I also ask why Ed has a sandwich closet, but I know I'll never know the answer. Pick on Ed is an interesting story for the show to explore. When Eddy finds someone's written graffiti about him, he goes undercover as an exchange student named Carl to find out who did it. But his change in identity also results in a clean slate and maybe a fresh start with the other kids. Like Ed in a Half Shell, this episode isn't that funny as much as it is intriguing. It's fascinating seeing Eddy adopting a new identity and the other kids adopting him. The only one who knows Carl is Eddy is Double D, so to everyone else is a brand new kid who has never done them wrong. Someone who's friendly, likes to hang out, is good with sports, that might be a great addition to a cast that's remained the same since the beginning, and it's compelling seeing Eddy acclimate to the fact, at first being confused and standoffish, but easing into the fact that he has a chance at a new reputation. In fact, with the show now being comfortable with the double-length episodes, I wish this could have been one. I legitimately want to see more of Carl and how the other kids treat him. But no, he upsets Double D, who alters the graffiti and reminds Eddy what he was originally trying to do, which he never does, despite a mad rush to reintroduce himself over and over again, eventually leading to being found out and everything being put back to normal. And while there's not much humor, we get a funny running gag from an oblivious Ed, who thinks Eddy's gone missing and posts flyers all over school while giving out unflattering descriptors to hopefully help the kids find him. While this isn't an episode I frequently watch, it's an interesting change-up and one I wish was expanded on, also playing some perverted snitch. Truth or Ed is another absolute favorite of mine. The Eds are put in charge of the school paper, but the sales are middling at best, so Eddy turns it into a sleazy tabloid to drum up business, while forgetting the number one rule of yellow journalism: make sure the victim can't fight back. The opening with the kids playing basketball isn't that exciting, except for Ed's lines at the end, but I love every single second afterwards. I love the layout of the newspaper office. I love the underwhelming headlines that clearly indicate why the paper isn't doing well. And I especially love what happens when Eddy takes over with his own fabricated stories. They look like articles from The Onion or Weekly World News, stories that are clearly fake, made no better by Eddy's horribly amateur photo editing skills, which make it a delight just to freeze on each picture and try to identify each element. This is actually something I tried to do as a kid, but it was too laborious to keep up. Then there's the glorious chaos that erupts as the kids buy the papers and start blaming each other for spreading rumors, followed by a march on the office and final battle. And besides the main plot, Ed gets some of his best lines in the season, including a running gag involving Eddy's pen name that leads to his undoing. And for added fun, some of the articles are readable and written in Double D style of prose. Some even following events of the episode, like Sarah smashed a car so the principal had to take the bus home. There's not one dull moment here. It's a blast from beginning to end and easily in my top 5 best episodes. Heck, just the joke with Rolf's pig makes it worth a watch. This won't hurt an Ed is an episode on torn on. Eddy, tired of all the attention Kevin is getting, finds that he has a morbid fear of needles, so he tricks the school into thinking it's Booster Shot Day and watches Kevin rather than Fear. Yeah, this is another torture episode, this time starring Kevin, which okay, he's lost most of my respect after You're Right Here, but that doesn't mean I want to see him constantly in misery either. Practically the entire runtime is Eddy preying on Kevin's fear of needles, stalking him everywhere, putting up traumatizing flyers, and even building giant syringe just to scare Kevin beyond his threshold. Yeah, this is another one where Eddy is absolutely despicable. Kevin didn't even do anything to him this time. He just wants to traumatize him out of jealousy, like a little psycho, but Eddy doesn't get his comeuppance, which makes this better than You're Right Here. What redeems this episode is Ed, who is absolutely hilarious. He again has some of the best lines in the season, especially when he's reciting what Eddy told him to say verbatim, complete with insult. And I love his head inflating and deflating. It's also comforting to see the other kids freaking out about the alleged booster shot, showing that a fear of needles is normal and common. In fact, it's revealed Eddy's a little hypocrite and hates them too, which makes the ending all the more satisfying. So even with how horrible Eddy is and how sorry I feel for Kevin, this isn't a terrible episode and I watch it from time to time. And with the nurse's silhouetted arm at the end, this marks another adult sighting in the show. Tinker Ed is a very hated episode. When Eddy's latest scam destroys Jimmy's belief in fairy tales, and with his cheer, Sarah demands the Eds fix him, which they try to do by dressing as fairy tale creatures and embarrassing themselves for the world to see. When people say season 5 was the worst, this smile for the Ed and cleanliness index for Edness is usually what they point to. And while I've seen episodes that contradict that statement, I'm not going to pretend this one is good. Eddy's scam is Here's Mud at Your Ed levels of diabolical, preying on Jimmy's delusions for a quick buck, though at least he bothered to set something up this time. And when he destroys Jimmy's innocence, he just shrugs and heads off to spend his loot, so it takes Sarah to convince them to fix Jimmy, which they try to do, but I have no idea what they're trying to do. Honestly, not a lot happens of this episode, or at least it feels that way. They ruin Jimmy, they try to fix Jimmy, and Jimmy ruins them, which is the one saving grace of this episode, that it's the return of evil Jimmy, who gives Eddy a taste of his own medicine and gets his money back at the same time. Besides that, there's very little funny to be found. There's a running gag where Rolf thinks everyone's after his little load of baloney, and the most I can say is that it's there. Besides Jimmy's revenge, the one thing I like is Jimmy seeing the unicorn scam through fantasy vision before it cuts to how crude everything actually looks. While I don't think it's as bad as others see it, this episode is still pretty repulsive, and only not one of the worst just because I keep forgetting it exists. So check out the reanimated deleted scene. The good, the bad, and the Ed, in my opinion, is really good. Eddy, tired of being mocked by the Urban Rangers, challenges them to a hairy chest of resilience competition, where the one who resists the most pain gets a badge. And as torture ramps up, the winner surprisingly remains ambiguous. I know a lot of people hate this episode, but I've never been more surprised with Eddy than I am here. Usually Eddy will try to win through cheating or sabotage, but here he actually toughs out every single horribly painful challenge. Everything thrown at him, he endures without a single cry or scream that would get him disqualified. Even with his much weaker stature than Rolf's, he has such immense pride that he wants to win just so he can say he did, and in a strange way, that's very admirable. It's like watching the school bully go up against a champion boxer and survive multiple rounds. Even if you hate them, you're still in awe at what they managed to do. Besides, it's just fun watching these massive egos go toe-to-toe with each other, as well as all the different methods thrown at them to cause immense pain and suffering. I guess this is a torture episode, but both competitors literally ask for it, and it's so entertaining seeing them in such excruciating pain like delusional denial. Even the opening, where the Urban Rangers display their talents in yard work, is entertaining and makes me appreciate the group even more. I guess my one problem is the ending, where I'm probably not spoiling anything by revealing Eddy doesn't win. Even so, this is one of my favorite episodes of the season, and mostly regains my respect for Eddy. You know what respect he deserves after all he's done. Tight End Ed is possibly the least fitting episode of the entire series. Morale is low for the Peach Creek Cobblers football team, so Naz recruits Ed as his team mascot. All is well until Eddy becomes jealous and challenges him with his own mascot, leading to chaos on the field. Rewatching the series, I'm finally starting to understand why fans don't like the school season. Most of the episodes that actually take place at school just feel like generic school sitcom plots. Sure, most of the show has had plots we've seen in other media, but the school episodes, even good ones like Truth or Ed, feel particularly recycled. I mean, it's about a loser football team where the two biggest losers fight over who gets to be the mascot and ruin everything for everyone. Couldn't you see this exact same plot with these exact same jokes in some other animated or even live-action school sitcom? This isn't Ed and Eddy, this is Saved by the Bell with special guest stars Ed and Eddy. Heck, I wish there was a laugh track because the humor in this is so Disney Channel it hurts. I think the only funny part is where Eddy sided the back of the opposing team's bus and made their mascot. Now I stand by that the season has a lot of good episodes that save it, but I also admit I didn't watch them on TV. I didn't have cable when this season came out and only saw years later in fan compilations, so if I was a fan watching this season as it released, hoping for something as good as the day the Ed stood still but getting a string of episodes like this instead, I probably would have given up too. I guess this episode's not a bad one, but it feels so out of place. Also, Rolf's kinky in this. I don't want to talk about Queen Rock in another place. Johnny's throwing an out-of-season Arbor Day party, and the Eds show up to mingle, only to find they're the only guests who showed up. Now, to be fair, I do like the opening gag where the Eds are doing a science project and guiding Ed to a slice of pie only for Eddy to mess with them, but afterwards, it's every single awkward party episode from every single other sitcom. Like I was saying in the last episode, it just doesn't feel like Ed and Eddy. This is something you'd see in an episode of Doug, and just as boring. Ed gets some fleeting moments, and Johnny reciting everyone's lame excuses why they couldn't come is a decent laugh, but otherwise, they're just banking on the awkwardness of the party being funny. I can't believe I'm saying this, but I'd rather watch Just Her with Ed. Sure, I despise that one too, but it was funnier and actually felt like part of the show. And I hate Johnny here more than I hated Naz there. The Eds did him a huge favor in coming to his party, but when Eddy tries to leave, he emotionally manipulates everyone into staying. Yeah, he starts crying, and when he gets his way, he says he was just kidding, the little turd. But things really hit the fan when Ed and Johnny declare it a never-ending party, boarding up the doors, tying Eddy and Double D up, and forcing them to party wits. Holy crap! Johnny just went from weird kid to serial killer in 5 seconds, and with this, I think we finally have his worst episode, the final holdout. Just don't watch this, or at the very least, turn it off after the opening gag. It's one of the absolute worst, and I'm surprised the next episode didn't start with Johnny wearing clothes made from the Ed's skin. All Eds Are Off is thankfully another of the season's best. All the boys bet each other that they can give up their worst attributes for even one day. Ed can't have gravy, Eddy can't shout, Double D must use small words, and the challenge is on to see who's the last man standing. I already talked about how pointless I find episodes featuring characters trying to change their personality since it's just going to go back to the status quo by the end, but in this case, that's a point. The show knows we know these changes are going to carry over. It's just an endurance test to see who can go the longest without their defining characteristics, and like the good, the bad, and the Ed, it's a blast seeing these massive egos suffering under the weight of their own addictions. Johnny promises to give up plank, then realizes he has no autonomy of his own and begs others to tell him what to do. Rolf gives up meat as is basically a desiccated corpse a few hours later. It's hilarious yet also relatable. There are quite a few things in my life where I start to go bonkers if I can't have them for even a few hours. And I'm sure you have some too. And none of this is helped by Eddy, who of course cheats his way to victory, or near victory anyway, which is also very entertaining to watch, as well as each kid eventually cracking under the strain. Even a couple background jokes are funny, like Plank sitting on a book titled Brains, indicating his role in Johnny's life. I guess this is another plot we've seen in every other sitcom, but it works here because the challenges are specific to this show's characters. I don't know what else to say other than it's a really fun episode and suspenseful who will emerge the victor, and I wish my school had this cafeteria budget. Smile for the Ed is another episode called The Worst. If Eddy can take a good school picture, he can move into his brother's room, but Kevin ruins it for him, then proceeds to rub salt in the wound. Yeah, this episode has the exact same problem as your Ed here. Kevin is a bully for absolutely no reason. Eddy doesn't even talk to him, yet Kevin randomly decides to ruin his moment. Now, to its credit, I like this episode more than the other one, if just because Eddy isn't in continual misery and in Double D are aware of his torment and try to help him out. And despite what I've heard from fans are some funny moments, I like everyone's reactions to getting their pictures taken, and Ed gets a couple laughs, including when he steals a photocopier. But the funniest is when Double D impersonates the principal to help Eddy, then immediately has a crisis of conscience. That said, I think Kevin is more despicable in this one. Not content to ruin Eddy's school picture, he then copies it and posts it all around the school to the point the other kids start wearing them and mocking Eddy. This is just whole new levels of holy crap. And when Eddy gets one last chance for a good picture, Kevin has to step in and ruin it again. And with that, Kevin has become the most despicable character in the entire show, and I take back everything good I ever said about him. Words cannot describe how sorry I feel for Eddy, who did nothing wrong and is screwed out of a new room and receives attention on top of it. Some say it's bad because it's the only one not directed by Danny, but considering we've had worse episodes than this, that's debatable. Still, I can't give you one good reason to watch it. It's not the worst, but it's one of the worst, even if it has another parent sighting. Run Ed Run is an unfortunately overlooked episode. It's field trip dated a Jawbreaker factory, but Sarah convinces Ed the sky is falling, causing the Eds to miss the bus, so they must catch up to it while entertaining Ed's illusion of danger. You know what this is? This is what Sorry Wrong Ed should have been. A character is convinced something supernatural is going to happen, so what does Double D do? He helps out. He doesn't just stand off to the side and call his friends stupid, he plays along and helps Ed overcome his fear, and when something unexpected does happen, he's overjoyed and excited to see what he can learn from it. Oh my god, thank you! Why was this so hard to do earlier? Besides that, this is another fast-paced race talk episode, and those are usually the best. It's so much fun seeing Double D cobble together a super-powered scooter to catch up with the bus. There's also a running gag where Eddy's fighting with Jimmy and Sarah to get the front seats, and how he technically does it is hilarious, even if it involves him using his own arm like a lasso. If there's another thing I've noticed about this season is that character physiologies are much more cartoonishly malleable, including literally losing their heads. Which isn't something earlier seasons did, but I guess isn't that out of place. Ed is also a lot of fun in this, especially when he's trying to shield his friends from the falling sky. My only problem is the very ending, which gets gross, but you can turn it off and miss nothing. I don't see many people talk about this one. I guess after Smile for the Ed, most fans gave up entirely and missed the next episode, which is a darn shame since this is another one of the season's best. And it's a better Chicken Little story you want Disney turned out. A town called Ed is also an unfair overlook. While researching for their History of Peach Creek report, the Eds find that Eddy's ancestors were the first to colonize the area. Eddy tries to capitalize on his heritage, only to be completely ignored as usual, so he has to force his history into their homes. This is yet another plot we've seen done to death in sitcoms where one of the characters turns out to be descended from importance, but it works here because everyone just ignores the fact. They're not interested in the history of someone they hate that want to watch monster trucks at Kevin's house. And how Eddy gets them to pay attention is genius. He attaches a coat hanger to their antenna, which leads to their camera where the Eds put on a pageant about the founding of Peach Creek, which would that actually work? I don't know. I'm laughing too hard at their incredibly amateur production to care, which Eddy of course has to ruin with his ego. I also love the visual of them distractedly wandering home, especially since there's another tour through their many set pieces, and this museum is worth pausing on to see what they think counts as history. And to top it off, this may have the funniest canker appearance of the whole series. Not only is how they're introduced really funny, but there's a running gag where a page is missing from the book, which I happen to have, and I'm not spoiling what it says. I think this might be another perfect episode. I can't see a single thing wrong with it. Nothing drags and every joke is funny, and it's one of my favorites. This is a sinfully ignored episode and one that deserves more attention. This group of Eddy pilgrims alone makes it worth watching. A fistful of Ed technically wraps up the season. Double E is finally snapped and the entire school fears his wrath. But like Ed, is Double E really a monster or just misunderstood? While the season had a mixed reception, this is the one episode fans seem to universally like. It's another that holds you in suspense, wondering what brought on these sudden unprovoked attacks from a kid who up until now wouldn't hurt a fly. We've seen Double E roughing out a character before, but is this a sign that he's finally snapped after years of being kicked around? Yeah, spoilers, each incident was a complete misunderstanding. Still, it's a lot of fun seeing all the ways Double E accidentally beats up each of the kids, and then equally as much fun later seeing his account of what actually happened to trigger each outburst. And once that's out of the way, Jimmy and Double E need to work together to get his reputation back, especially with Ed, who in a surprisingly heartbreaking moment cuts ties with Double D because of how mean he's become. This is one of the best written episodes of the series, with many twists and turns that could go anywhere, yet stay true to the tone of the show and keep the character personalities intact, until it's Jimmy's turn to snap anyway. And to top it off, it's a very rare instance where the Eds drive off the cankers, which might have had more impact if that hadn't already happened at the beginning, but it's a feel-good ending that's not often seen, yet again still fits the show. If this closed out the series, it would have been a good note to end on, but there's still more to Ed and Eddy watch, so let's hope the future is as bright as this episode's ending with just as many hot dogs. Right after Season 5 wrapped, the network launched Cartoon Network Invaded, where 5 of its then current lineup each had a special dedicated to an alien invasion. And The Eds Are Coming was the show's contribution. Jimmy has a horrible vision of aliens abducting the neighborhood, which the other kids laugh off, but when Rolf's house seemed to be even stranger than usual, the kids band together to flush out the alien menace. This has one of the scariest openings I've ever seen in animation. It's a deep-rooted fear of mine to see a portion of an entire planet destroyed, and with its dramatic scene of giant buzzsaws cutting away the cul-de-sac, this has one of the most traumatic examples I know of. Afterwards, the episode's mostly in the It Came From Outer Ed camp of not being that funny, but very enjoyable to see where it's all leading. This has some of the best visuals in the entire show, with unbelievably impressive coloring lighting effects. The neighborhood just feels so big and otherworldly with these dynamic camera angles and this green fog that permeates most of the episode. Just like the day the Eds stood still, the crew knew how to parody yet pay tribute to alien invasion movies. And I like how the plot surprisingly fits within this mostly grounded universe. Everyone's still in character and it feels like what a group of kids would try to do, and Double D wows us again with impressive dunk conventions. Like I said, there are many jokes. Ed gets a good line here and there, but nothing really made me laugh, at least until the twist ending, which both is and isn't what you think it is. But it's such a visual spectacle and a marvelous mystery, it's no wonder why it's usually considered the best of the specials. I highly recommend it, if you can, go watch the rest of the events as well. While the show was meant to have a movie instead of another season, somebody didn't get the memo, thus we have the 2-segment season 6, starting with May I Have This Said. It's their first school dance and the kids are really excited, all except Double D, who is terrified of social interaction. This is mostly just another episode of one joke. Ed and Eddy want to go to the dance and Double D doesn't, like a reverse Cinderella. So it's just watching Ed and Eddy trying to learn how to dance and impress girls and Double D trying to excuse himself. It starts to get monotonous, even the humor isn't that great. Sure, there are a couple good gags at the start, but they feel random, like they were put in just to keep the audience from leaving. Though I do like Ed's reenactment of the Attack of the Mutant TV tray, and that incoherent record crooning will forever remain in my head, but things start to pick up during the dance, where lol, all the boys are too scared to dance with Naz, though me mocking them further would be too hypocritical. So they try every excuse and hiding place to avoid it, only for Double D to end up dancing with her, which of course makes Marie Canker jealous. One thing leads to another, entire school is destroyed. That was pretty entertaining, so while this episode technically wasn't meant to exist, this is decent enough that I'm glad it does. Also, I wish I had the talent to build my own $sign snowman. Okay, I played good cop with the other episode, but looking for you, Ed doesn't need to exist. Double E and Jimmy start a safety club where they neurotically patrol the grounds for anything they deem unsafe. This is another plot I've seen in quite a few shows, and I don't think it's ever worked. All they're doing is being killjoys and ruining everyone's fun, or at least they would be if anyone cared, which is the one saving grace that everyone just ignores them. And good, because I can't stand Double E or Jimmy and their self-righteous attitudes. My happy place is when they're run over by the school building. Making things worse is that I can't think of one good joke. There's a running gag where Ed thinks he's breathing smoke, and all I can say is ew, though I guess it's cute seeing Double D entertaining Ed's fantasy. And I think Eddy was onto something, reappropriating Double D's de-icing machine into a snow cone maker, but in the end, Jimmy gets tired of the Eds, takes over the club, and imprisons the Eds in a dumpster. And literally, the last joke of the series is Eddy wetting himself, and that concludes the show. Personally, I wish we got at least one more season, maybe show it changing from winter back to summer and school out again just to bookend the series, but a future episodes where it's hit or misses this last season, maybe things were better off ending. But even if no more episodes, this look is not done yet, as we've yet to see their feature-length magnum opus. And thus, we've finally reached Ed and Eddy's Big Picture Show, the film to wrap things up. Since this is a 90-minute movie, I'm going to do this in multiple parts. The beginning of the movie is one of the greatest animated sequences I've ever seen. It opens on an oddly empty neighborhood that looks normal otherwise until it reveals the aftermath of the terrible incident. The visuals say more than any dialogue could, and we don't see a single character for the first 2 minutes. Then we're abruptly hit with each of the Eds panicking about a scam going wrong as they all hurriedly pack to leave, eventually leading to them having to hide in Eddy's brother's room from a mob of angry kids. The tension is so thick as they try to remain quiet, you could cut it with a knife, but they're found, creating another suspense sequence where they have to get out of the room before the kids break the door down. All where we get glimpses glimpses of the disfigured victims, and culminating in one of the greatest car chases I've ever seen, if they're not technically driving the car. This first 15 minutes should be taught in film schools. It's a perfect blend of action, suspense, visuals and dialogue, slapstick, and seriousness. And while the animation style stays the same, it shows off the movie's much higher budget, and we're ruining a couple landmarks because, hey, we'll never see them again, and the best part, we never find out what the Eds did. Just that it was somehow worse than every other scam they've pulled, and the kids literally want to track them down and kill them for it, and I'm fine with that. It's much funnier to just draw our own conclusions. This is an unbelievably good opening, and I'm happy to watch over and over again, but what's the rest of the movie like? Okay, I'm not going to make any friends for this, but after the opening, most of the movie just met. Eddy suggested they can hide from the kids by staying with his ever-mentioned, ever-seen brother, and the rest of the movie is them trying to find him and having no idea where they're going. Now, this movie isn't bad. Its energy is kept high throughout the runtime with the same great humor and slapstick we appreciate the show for, but that's also the problem. It's still formatted like a regular episode. Most scenes don't last that long, and the humor is quick and spitfire. So it's entertaining, but eventually you want it to have a point, and the longer it goes, the less funny it feels. In fact, the opening might have hurt the movie, since the rest feels nowhere as good. It doesn't help that it's a road trip, like most movies based on cartoons. We'll see some gorgeous new landscapes that show off the movie's budget, but they're just there for the characters to aimlessly walk through. Characters that mostly just do what they've been doing for a decade by this point. Ed and Eddy goof around, leaving Double D to do all the work. At one point, Double D finally gives up on the others and tries to leave, which again happens in every single road trip movie. Thankfully, things are patched up quickly, but that's also all the conflict. We'll also see groups of kids after the Eds, and each mostly does one thing. Rolf is fun, but Jimmy, Sarah, and the Cankers might be the best, if just because I haven't seen them together in the show. People also seem to like Kevin and Naz, but I don't. The only joke is that Kevin loves his bike more, which doesn't work because his bike getting trashed was already running gag. Still, I get it. This isn't meant to be a standalone movie. It's a love letter to the show, filled with references for longtime fans to laugh at and reminisce on, and in that sense, it's fine, especially when we get to the ending. After a long and painful journey, the Eds finally stumble across where Eddy's brother lives, and coincidentally so do all the other kids, but Eddy threatens to stick his brother on everyone that goes up and knocks on the door, finally revealing Eddy's brother, the first new canon character since the first episode. And after not just the build-up of the movie, but the entire show since its first mention in season 1, I'm happy to say it was all worth it. Eddy's brother, who's never given him a name, looks exactly like you imagine Eddy's older brother to look, suave yet sleazy, like a shady Vegas bookie. While appearing friendly at first, he quickly turns abusive, saying the Eds can stay with him, but pummeling Eddy to hint that it will be a painful ordeal, finally confirming his and Eddy's toxic relationship. And it does start to get hard to watch. Thankfully, the other kids stand up to him, and he's defeated through the show's comedic sense of karma, with Eddy admitting most of his hero worship was out of fear, that all the good things he said about his brother were made up because he was afraid of saying anything bad about him, and the scars from his only role model still exist long after he left, hence why he's such a scam-obsessed jerk. I love how this explains Eddy's personality while not excusing or last-minute redeeming him, but thanks to his admission, he finally gains acceptance in the neighborhood, with the kids hailing the Eds as heroes and heading back home, thus concluding the movie and the entire series. So while I could take or leave the middle part, the beginning and ending are golden, and a perfect way to end one of the best cartoon series ever made, but I'm not quite ready to wrap things up, so let's see how far I can milk this retrospective. During and even after the series run, the Eds had cameos in other cartoons, mostly as part of larger crossovers. They had a non-speaking role in the Foster's episode Eddy Monster, where they and Dexter from Dexter's Laboratory are drawn in the show style. Double D, along with other classic cartoons, cameos in Once Upon a Toon, a segment of the CN Mad series, as well as the crossover Nexus episode of OKKO, which also had characters briefly take the form of the Eds in the Monster Party episode. Eddy and Jimmy make a quick appearance in the villainous episode The Missing Files of Elmore, which is actually centered around Gumball. The show's mentioned in Craig of the Creek's Kelsey the Elder, and a list of shows Craig and Fred's are too young to know about. Johnny and Plank are fighting the corruption and come to learn with Pibby, and Plank the College Years was a segment on Robot Chicken. The Eds make brief appearances in the Warner Brothers 100th anniversary Teen Titans Go episode, and are seen on Uncle Grandpa's list in the Steven Universe episode Say Uncle. As part of Cartoon Network Invaded, the cul-de-sac being abducted is shown in the My Jeb Hoarder's a Monkey episode That Darn Platypus, which is next. And in the original credits of Billy and Mandy's contribution, Billy and Mandy Moon the Moon, Plank is shown as an undercover operative of the aliens, and that they've abducted Ed. But the most major appearance, or at least where the Eds actually have speaking roles, with their scene in the opening of The Grim Adventure of the Kid Next Door, which also has a parody poster in the credits featuring Mandy in place of Eddy. There are other network crossovers, but we'll get to those next. As part of Cartoon Network's lineup, Ed and Eddy of course had original bumpers during commercials. Obviously, most of these weren't done by the original studio, so it's weird seeing this Uncanny Valley attempt at their famous art style. But thankfully, the voice actors and general sense of humor still carried over, as it was one of the longest running shows on the channel across network eras and had promos based on the image at the time, with more traditional bumpers to start with, eventually leading to the acclaimed city bumpers, which sometimes could be just as entertaining as the show itself. But the best were the crossovers that the network, even in its early days, liked to do, because they got weird. There was one where Eddy shot spitballs at Captain Planet, there was one where Marvin the Martian took over for Double D, there was one where Jimmy's playing hide and seek with the other cartoons, and my personal favorite where the Eds sneak into a movie theater by pretending to be Mac's imaginary friends. There's one actually made by the studio called Toon Dates, where Ed dates Daphne from Scooby-Doo. Yes, really, it even premiered a new character created specifically for the short, years before Eddy's brother. There's also a series where Eduardo from Foster's visited the Eds universe, but only a few seconds still exist. And there's the infamous Spanish Kiss promo, which ew. But the topper of weirdness were promos for Cartoon Network created by Hoopshots TV that feature a more adult edge, including, and I'm not kidding here, the Eds nearly being sold in and escaping from a human trafficking ring. Holy crap, how did anyone sign off on that? And thanks to Adult Swim's Check Your Pass block, the Eds are still getting new promos to this day. At one point, CN produced Cartoon Network Groovies, most of which featured original songs about the characters in question, and there were two for Ed and Eddy. My best friend Plank is the one that feels the closest to the show. It's a tribute to Plank, a low-key guitar ballad in the style of James Taylor featuring a lot of wood puns. The song was composed and possibly sung by Steve Patrick, who composed a good chunk of the Groovies, and I 100% believe this is from Johnny's point of view. In fact, it's how sincere it is that makes it work. It would have been so easy to sing it in a silly voice, but because it's done so seriously, like something you'd hear in an oldie station, it's simultaneously hilarious, hardly tear-jerking. Helped immensely by the music video produced by Film Technarna, known for the unique blend of computer animation and photographic stills, skills. Meanwhile, the Incredible Shrinking Day is more experimental. The video shows Sarah concocting a potion and serving it to the Eds, causing them to shrink and allowing her to play with them in her dollhouse. And if that sounds out of character, that's the entire video. The personalities and animation style are completely different from the show, to the point the only tie-in on the character designs, but it's still fine, and we get a great mix of traditional and computer animation as the Eds try to avoid Sarah. And the music for this one is an unreleased song titled I'm Not Coming In Anymore, which was not sung by They Might Be Giants, but Garrick Fryreich, who proudly features a song on their website. And it's worth mentioning rapper J.I.D.'s Eddy and Eddy, whose music video is animated in the show style, though it's definitely not for kids. As with many Cartoon Network shows, the Eds have had multiple comic appearances, many of which appeared in the network's own Block Party magazines, and quite a few were written by series co-writer Jono Howard and penciled by regular series storyboarders Scott Underwood and Joel Dickey. So the personalities, humor, and artwork still match the show, as well as the show's generally high level of quality. In fact, if they weren't credited, I never would have known these were made by other writers and artists. Obviously, there are too many stories to feature here, so these are the standouts of what I was able to find. There's one where Ed is sinking Rolf's pig pen, and the other Ed charges the kids to watch him rescue him. There's one where Eddie finds a quarter every time he rubs Kevin's head and technically comes out on top. There's one where the Eds pretend they're superheroes, which is much more entertaining than Robin Ed. There's one where Eddie can't think of a scam, which again is done better than Stuck in Ed. And there's one where they're dressed as girls to coast presents from the boys, which strangely enough feels like the best candidate for an episode of the show. The Eds also appeared in the crossover comic event Super Secret Crisis War, where they're accidentally abducted along with some of the network's greatest heroes. And yeesh, not only does their artwork make the Incredible Shrinking Day look accurate, but they barely count as themselves. They're not horrendously out of character, but they're blank slates with only the barest personality traits, to the point they say dude a lot, which I don't think they said once in the show. Yeah, they're pretty wasted here, but if you can track down the other comics, they're highly worth a read. And to wrap up the show's licensed products, the Eds have their share of video games, which I haven't played any of, so I can only give a basic rundown on each. Jawbreakers, released in 2003 through the GBA, is a Lost Vikings-inspired platformer puzzle game, where the players guide the Eds to the end of each level, all of whom have their own strengths and weaknesses to utilize and clear the paths for the others. This was followed by a pseudo-sequel called Giant Jawbreakers, released in 2004 for mobile phones, which is actually a version of Buster Brothers, where the Eds shatter giant jawbreakers into shards that can safely be eaten, which completely misses the joke of the show. The Misadventures, released for the popular console in 2005, is the one most people know of. It's a 3D platformer where each level takes the form of an episode of the show, including title cards and limited 2D cutscenes. I really wanted to play this game and review it for this series, but used copies go for insane prices and I just didn't have the money. Still, huge props for including the original voice cast. And finally, Scam of the Century, made for DS in 2007, which is a pretty generic side-scrolling platformer with some touchscreen and microphone functionality, since it was a cool thing back then. The Eds also appeared in the crossover games Cartoon Network Block Party, a Mario Party clone, and Cartoon Network Speedway, a Mario Kart clone, both for the GBA. A lot of Flash games centered on the show were hosted on the Cartoon Network site, and they appeared with anime-inspired designs in the MMO Fusion Fall, but sadly these are no longer accessible. In 2004, Cartoon Network ran their own version of a presidential election, but unlike their previous cartoon campaign 2000s, the candidates were simplified down to the parties of Ed and Vice President Grimm, Number 1 and Vice President Eduardo, and Single Runner Plank. It was during this time I was first able to regularly watch Cartoon Network, so I remember a lot of these ads. In fact, watching them again as an adult, it's scary how similar to real campaign ads they are. The man on the street opinions, the mudslinging, using opponents' words against them, the appeal to national pride by playing their slogan over a patriotic song, and the promises are worded vaguely enough that a candidate can say they meant anything when elected. There's even one for Plank that references the crying Indian ad, which was outdated even for 2004 and really hasn't aged well now. Like my best friend Plank, these ads work thanks to how seriously they were taken. Heck, each campaign even felt like they had the budget of a political party's candidate actually running for office. Sadly, a lot of these ads appear to be lost to time. I remember one with Number 1 saying how much he hates puppies, and a later one even featured the late great Joseph Barbera in favor of Ed. Still, you gotta love these shots of kids and adults wearing monobrows and skull makeup in favor of their chosen party. And that was me too, as I also voted for Ed and Grimm, who won in a landslide on November 5th, 2 days after the actual presidential election, and given who we ended up with, I think the fictional election had the better turnout. I think we're done with Eddy and Eddy, so let's focus on the show's creator for a while. Danny Junichi has worked as an animator throughout the 80s, attached to some relatively popular movies and shows, but it was a solo project, Lupo the Butcher, in 1987 where he made a name for himself. There's not a lot to say concerning this short. It's a 3-minute animation featuring an Italian butcher who swears up a storm while chopping a rack of ribs, accidentally cutting off his thumb and eventually going to pieces by the end. That's all that happens, but like multiple episodes of Eddy and Eddy, that's really all that needs to happen. This is the very definition of cartoon anarchy. No point, no plot, yet incredible animation attached to a surreal premise that will have you laughing at the absurdity of it all, provided you can stomach strong profanity and blood. Upon release, the short received critical acclaim and the attention of the Converse Shoe Company at MTV, who both used the character in various commercials, which then led to Danny being tasked to work on other shows and commercials, but we'll get to that later. After being retired in the early 90s, Lupo would briefly re-emerge in 2020 when a Netflix show starring the character was announced, but was cancelled due to the creative differences between Danny and Netflix, who apparently wouldn't give him creative control and wanted a more family-friendly series, which, no, just no. But Lupo continues to be Danny's alter ego, hence the multiple appearances of his name in Eddy and Eddy. After the success of Lupo the Butcher, Danny and his new animation studio, aka Cartoon, were hired to create content for multiple companies and networks, most of which does still survive. There's the aforementioned Lupo the Butcher ads we looked at. There's a really funny bumper for ESPN2 featuring what looks like a middle-aged Eddy ordering cable. There's a Levi's commercial that's about as 90s as you can get. There's one for milk, which will be the most entertaining milk commercial you'll ever see. There's the opening for the MTV animated anthology show Cartoon Sushi, which he also wrote and voice acted for. There are other ads for the Converse Shoe Company, and an ad for Power Shoe for Kids Foot Locker entitled The Adventures of Kung Shu, which has gained attention for practically being the prototype for what would become Eddy and Eddy. Eddy, including one character who sounds suspiciously similar to Eddy. He also created multiple bumpers for Cartoon Network featuring a Jester character, which was probably the foot in the door that finally allowed him to pitch Eddy and Eddy, which the network showed interest in but wouldn't allow him creative control. But after going back and forth pitching the idea to both Cartoon Network and Nickelodeon, the CN finally relented and allowed him to take the show where he wanted, thus leading to what would eventually become his legacy, and hiring a lot of people who would go on to make the extremely popular My Little Pony Friendship is Magic series. Bet you didn't know that. Oh, we also made the Brothers Grunt show for MTV, but we don't talk about that. Let's finally wrap things up with a look at Danny's latest project, Snot Rocket. Finished in 2017, this was intended as a pilot for a potential show made with Canadian media conglomerate WildBrain. The show centers around a hyperactive young boy named Buster and his overactive imagination, demanding constant playtime with his dog Butch, who just wants some quiet time to himself, but is a continual brunt of the wrath of Buster's neglectful parents. Meanwhile, identical twin girl neighbors repeatedly try to involve Buster in the playtime, humiliating him and requiring Butch to save him at his own expense. This is like the Calvin and Hobbes animated series everyone wants, but the creator refuses to make. It's about a hyperactive little kid as we follow him through his vivid imagination while dragging his more grounded and ambiguously imaginary friend along for the ride. And that's a fantastic premise for a series, especially from someone who's proven he's an expert with fast-paced slapstick and surreal humor. And while it's obviously not cel-drawn and lacks the wavy lines of his previous projects, Danny's designs and trademarks are still here, including never actually seeing the parents, the bully neighbor girls, and the fascination with B-movie science fiction. Sadly, the show appears to have been cancelled since Danny was denied creative control, and nothing has been heard since, thus for now closing the book on his work in Eddy and Eddy. Well, thanks for joining me on this trip through one of my absolute favorite shows and for pretending I'm entertaining. See you next time I decide to do another one of these.